In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a glamorous widow, Eleanor Grayson, hides a dark secret behind her charming smile. When a mysterious stranger is found dead in her garden, Miss Jane Marple's keen eye and quiet wisdom unravel a web of blackmail, betrayal, and a shocking truth about love and greed. As whispers turn to accusations, only Miss Marple can expose the killer and the harsh reality that even the most charming facades conceal deadly secrets. Will justice prevail in this gripping 14-chapter mystery? Chapter 1. The quiet return. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the winding lanes of the village. The air carried the faint scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, a testament to the meticulous care of the villagers who prided themselves on their tidy gardens. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of her modest cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale pink shawl. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her age, flickered occasionally to the street outside. The bustle of the city had been invigorating, but it was here, in the quiet embrace of her village, that Miss Marple felt truly at home. St. Mary Mead had a way of revealing its secrets to those who knew how to listen, and Miss Marple was an expert listener. Her fingers paused mid-stitch as she caught sight of Mrs. Price. The urgency in her step was unusual, and Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Something was afoot. The village had been abuzz with gossip even before her return, as Raymond had mentioned in his last letter. A new resident, Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, had taken up residence at Willow Cottage, a charming but long-vacant house at the edge of the village. Widow to a wealthy industrialist, Eleanor was said to be in her late 40s, with a refined air and a wardrobe that spoke of London's finest boutiques. The villagers, always eager for fresh faces to dissect, had wasted no time in speculating about her past. Was she truly grieving her late husband, or was there something more to her sudden arrival in St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple, though not one to indulge in idle gossip, found her curiosity piqued. She set her knitting aside and rose. A walk through the village would do her good, and perhaps she might learn more about this Mrs. Grayson. Donning her straw hat and slipping on her sensible shoes, the distant hum of a lawnmower and the chirping of sparrows. She passed the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was tending to her roses. The woman looked up, her face lighting with a smile. "Miss Marple, you're back," Mrs. Clement called, brushing soil from her hands. "We've missed you at the Women's Institute. How was London?" "Quite lively, as always," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but measured. "But I'm glad to be home. I hear we have a new neighbor at Willow Cottage." Mrs. Clement's eyes gleamed with the eagerness of one who loved to share news. "Oh yes, Mrs. Grayson, a most elegant woman, though a bit reserved. She's been keeping to herself, mostly, but she did attend the church service last Sunday. Sat in the front pew, all in black, with a hat that must have cost a fortune." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "A widow, I understand." "So she says," Mrs. Clement replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Her husband passed 2 years ago, they say, but no one knows much about him. Some sort of businessman, I gather. She's got money, that's clear, but there's something well guarded about her. A wealthy widow, newly arrived, with a past shrouded in mystery. St. Mary Mead had seen such figures before, and they often brought complications. They chatted a while longer. Mrs. Clement rattling off the latest village happenings, the new curates, awkward sermons, the squabble over the flower rhoda. Miss Marple listened attentively, filing away each detail. It was in these seemingly trivial conversations that the threads of a larger tapestry often emerged as she continued her walk. The house was a picture of rustic charm, with its ivy-clad walls and neatly trimmed hedges. The windows gleamed, and the garden was in full bloom, suggesting a diligent gardener or, more likely, hired help. A woman stood at the gate, her back to the lane, adjusting a string of fairy lights along the fence. Her movements were graceful, her figure accentuated by a tailored navy dress. This, Miss Marple deduced, must be Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. Afternoon, Miss Marple called softly, pausing a few steps away. The woman turned, revealing a face that was striking yet weary. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her eyes, a deep hazel, held a flicker of surprise. Kind of her, Miss Marple said with a smile. I hope you're settling in well. Willow Cottage is a lovely place, though it's a bit overwhelming, moving to a new place. Everyone's been very kind. They are a friendly lot here, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. But I imagine it's quite different from the city. Eleanor's smile faltered. Just for a moment. Yes, quite. I needed a change, you see, after everything. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, noting the hesitation. A fresh start can do wonders. I shan't keep you, Mrs. Grayson. I'm sure you have plenty too. Do, thank you, Eleanor said, her tone polite but distant. I'd like that, Miss Marple replied, tipping her head before continuing her walk. As she moved away, she felt the familiar prickle of intuition. Eleanor Grayson was charming, poised, and undeniably guarded. There was a story there, one that Miss Marple suspected would soon unravel. The village green was lively that afternoon, with children playing near the pond and a group of women gathered outside the post office. Miss Marple paused to exchange pleasantries with Miss Hartnell, a stout woman known for her forthright opinions. All that finery, and yet she's so standoffish. Makes you wonder what she's hiding. Give her time, Miss Hartnell snorted. Time won't change a leopard's spots, Miss Marple. Mark my words, there's something not right about her. That woman, too, had been charming, and the truth of her past had been far darker than anyone expected. Miss Marple returned home, her mind buzzing with observations. She settled into her armchair, picking up her knitting once more. The village was quiet now, the golden light giving way to twilight. But beneath the calm, she sensed a current of unease. St. Mary Mead was never as sleepy as it seemed. Miss Marple was up, early, tending to her own small garden. She was pruning her roses when Mrs. Price, the postmistress, appeared at the gate, her face flushed with excitement. Miss Marple, have you heard? There's to be a tea party at the vicarage tomorrow, and Mrs. Grayson's been invited. Everyone's talking about it. Is that so? Miss Marple said, her interest piqued. Well, that will be a fine opportunity to get to know her better. Oh, it's more than that, Mrs. Price said, leaning closer. Uptight, mind you. Makes you wonder what's in them. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with curiosity. Does it now? Well, I'm sure it's nothing more than sentimental keepsakes. Mrs. Price looked unconvinced, but hurried off to spread the news. Widow, and a village ripe for secrets. St. Mary Mead was about to reveal something, and Miss Marple intended to be ready when it did. The tea party at the vicarage was a modest affair, with mismatched china and homemade scones arranged on a lace-covered table. Mrs. Clement presided with her usual efficiency, though Miss Marple noted a certain strain in her smile. The guests included the usual village stalwarts, Miss Hartnell, who fidgeted nervously under Mrs. Clement's watchful eye. Mrs. Grayson arrived precisely on time, her black silk dress understated, yet elegant. She greeted everyone with a warm smile, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the slight tremor in her hands as she accepted a cup of tea. The conversation was light. Bantry's new gardener, Miss Marple, seated near the window, listened more than she spoke, her knitting needles moving rhythmically. She observed how Mrs. Grayson deflected questions about her past, turning the conversation to local matters with practiced ease. Dr. Hartley, a handsome young man with a serious demeanor, seemed particularly attentive to her. For her husband, the group dispersed, leaving Miss Marple alone with Mrs. Grayson for a moment. "You have a lovely way with people," Miss Marple remarked, her tone gentle. "It reminds me of a dear friend I once had who could charm anyone but kept her own counsel." Mrs. Grayson's smile was tight. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I find it's easier to—" The tea party ended without incident, but Miss Marple's walk home was filled with reflection. She thought of the locked trunk, the guarded glances, and the faint unease that seemed to follow Mrs. Grayson like a shadow. St. Mary Mead was a small place, but its secrets were never small. As she reached her cottage, she paused at the gate, her eyes scanning the quiet lane. Somewhere in this village, a truth was waiting to be uncovered, and Miss Marple knew she would find it, one stitch at a time. The days that followed were deceptively calm. Miss Marple busied herself with village activities, attending the Women's Institute and helping with preparations for the summer fete. But her thoughts never strayed far from Mrs. Grayson. She made discreet inquiries, learning from Mrs. Bantry that Eleanor had hired a local girl, Lucy Evans, as a housekeeper. Lucy, a talkative young woman, had mentioned to the butcher that Mrs. Grayson received few visitors but spent hours in her study, sorting through papers. On the third day after the tea party, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Willow Cottage. She brought a small jar of her homemade gooseberry jam as an excuse, knowing such gestures were rarely refused. Mrs. Grayson welcomed her warmly, though her eyes held a trace of wariness. The sitting room was tastefully furnished, with heavy drapes and a polished mahogany table. A locked trunk sat in one corner, its brass fittings gleaming in the sunlight. "What a charming home," Miss Marple said, settling into an armchair. "You've made it your own already." "Thank you," Mrs. Grayson replied, pouring tea. "It's a work in progress, but I'm fond of it." They chatted about inconsequential things, the best time to plant lavender, the quirks of the village post office, but Miss Marple's eyes kept drifting to the trunk. "That's a fine piece," she said at last, nodding toward it. "An heirloom, perhaps." Mrs. Grayson's hand paused on the teapot. "Oh, that, yes, it belonged to my husband's family. Just old papers and such." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "I do love old letters. They tell such stories, don't they?" Mrs. Grayson's smile was strained. "Sometimes too many stories," she said softly, then changed the subject. The visit ended pleasantly enough, but Miss Marple left with a growing certainty that the trunk held the key to Mrs. Grayson's secrets. As she walked home, She recalled a case from her youth, when a locked box had contained evidence of a long-buried crime. History, she knew, had a way of repeating itself in St. Mary Mead. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, a knock at the door startled her. It was Lucy Evans, the housekeeper, her face pale and her hands twisting nervously. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice trembling. "But I saw something at Willow Cottage, and I don't know what to do." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said, ushering her inside. "Tell me everything." Lucy hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "It was last night, after Mrs. Grayson went to bed. I was tidying the study, and I saw her trunk open just for a moment before she closed it. There were letters, Miss Marple, and a photograph of a man, not her husband, I don't think, and there was a bottle, a small one, with a strange label. I didn't get a good look, but it gave me the shivers." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her voice remained calm. "Thank you for telling me, Lucy. It's probably nothing, but I'll keep it in mind. You mustn't worry." Lucy nodded, looking relieved, and left soon after. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting forgotten. A photograph, a bottle, and a locked trunk, small pieces, but they were beginning to form a picture. She thought of Mrs. Grayson's charm, so carefully wielded, and the faint cracks in her composure. Whatever truth lay hidden in Willow Cottage, Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. The next morning brought a fresh development. Mrs. Bantry, ever the source of village news, stopped by to share a startling tidbit. A man had been seen lingering near Willow Cottage late at night, a stranger in a dark coat. Mrs. Price swears she saw him peering through the hedge, Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes wide, and then he was gone, quick as you like. What do you make of that, Miss Marple? "I make nothing of it yet," Miss Marple replied, though her mind was racing. A stranger, a locked trunk, and a widow with a past St. Mary Mead was stirring. And Miss Marple knew that the quiet days were numbered as the week progressed. Miss Marple continued her gentle probing, speaking with villagers and observing Mrs. Grayson from a distance. She attended church on Sunday, where Mrs. Grayson sat in her usual pew, her face serene, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Hartley, seated nearby, seemed distracted, his eyes darting to Mrs. Grayson more than once. Miss Marple noted it all, her mind weaving a tapestry of clues and suspicions. By the end of the week, the village was abuzz with preparations for the fete, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She had seen enough to know that Mrs. Grayson's arrival was no mere coincidence. There was a pattern forming, one that reminded her of a case long ago, when a charming newcomer had brought trouble to St. Mary Mead. As she sat by her window, knitting in the fading light, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill. The truth was out there, waiting to be unraveled, and she would find it, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 2. A charming facade. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green, where preparations for the annual summer tea party were in full swing. Tables draped in crisp white linen dotted the lawn, laden with delicate porcelain teacups, plates of scones, and jars of homemade strawberry jam. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses, and the hum of conversation mingled with the clinking of teaspoons against china. It was the kind of afternoon that made St. Mary Mead feel like a postcard come to life, a perfect slice of English countryside charm. Yet, beneath the surface, Miss Jane Marple, sensed the faint ripples of something less idyllic. Miss Marple sat quietly at the edge of the gathering, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her age, darted from one villager to another, taking in the subtle gestures and fleeting expressions that others might overlook. She wore her usual attire, a simple tweed skirt, a cream blouse, and a light cardigan, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. To the untrained eye, she was merely a kindly old spinster, a fixture of the village as unremarkable as the ancient oak by the church. But to those who knew her, Miss Marple's unassuming presence was a quiet force. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument for detecting the undercurrents of human behavior. The tea party was hosted by Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose organizational zeal was matched only by her determination to maintain St. Mary Mead's social hierarchy. She flitted from table to table, her floral dress billowing, her smile as bright as the polished silver teapot she carried. "More tea, Miss Marple?" she asked, pausing beside the elderly woman's chair. "Thank you, Mrs. Clement, but I'm quite content for now," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but clear. She lifted her teacup, barely touched, and offered a polite smile. "You've outdone yourself this year. The roses are particularly lovely." Mrs. Clement beamed, though her eyes flickered with a hint of strain. "Oh, it's nothing, really. Just a little effort to keep the village spirit alive. We mustn't let standards slip, must we?" She glanced toward the center of the green, where a new face held court, Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the wealthy widow who had recently taken up residence at Willow Cottage. Eleanor Grayson was a striking woman, perhaps in her early 40s, with auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon and a figure that turned heads, even in her understated silk dress. Her laugh, bright and melodic, carried across the green as she chatted with a cluster of villagers, including Dr. Hartley, the young village doctor, and Mr. Petherick, the local solicitor. She moved with the grace of someone accustomed to attention, her gestures fluid, her smile warm yet carefully calibrated. To Miss Marple, it was the kind of charm that seemed both effortless and deliberate. Like a well-rehearsed performance. "She's quite the addition to St. Mary Mead, isn't she?" Mrs. Clement said, her tone laced with a mix of admiration and caution. "So refined, so generous. Did you know she's offered to fund the church roof repairs? Has she now?" Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. "That's very kind of her. She must be settling in well." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Clement said, lowering her voice. "Though, of course, we know so little about her. A widow, they say, and quite well off." But she trailed off, her lips pursing, as if she'd said too much. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Widows often carry their stories close to their hearts," she said mildly. "It takes time to share them." Mrs. Clement nodded, though her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. She moved on to the next table, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The old lady resumed her knitting, but her attention remained fixed on Eleanor Grayson. There was something about the woman's poise that reminded Miss Marple of a girl she'd known years ago in St. Mary Mead. A girl who had married a man with a charming smile and a cruel streak. That girl had learned to hide her pain behind a radiant facade, much like Eleanor seemed to do now as the afternoon wore on. Miss Marple observed the dynamics around Eleanor. Dr. Hartley, a lanky young man with earnest eyes and a slightly nervous manner, seemed particularly attentive. He hovered near Eleanor, offering her a plate of cucumber sandwiches, and laughing a little too loudly at her remarks. Miss Marple noted the flush on his cheeks, the way his gaze lingered on Eleanor's face. A young man smitten, she thought, though whether Eleanor returned his feelings was less clear. Her smiles were warm but non-committal, her attention evenly distributed among her admirers. Mr. Petherick, on the other hand, was more reserved. The solicitor, a wiry man with a penchant for bow ties, stood at a slight distance, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were precise, almost clipped. Miss Marple recalled that he had handled the legal affairs for Willow Cottage's previous owner, old Mrs. Bantry, and wondered if he knew more about Eleanor's affairs. Then he led on. The village children darted between tables, their laughter a counterpoint to the adults' polite chatter. Miss Marple watched as little Tommy Price, the baker's son, tripped over a tablecloth and nearly upset a tray of scones. Eleanor was quick to intervene, kneeling beside the boy with a gentle smile, brushing crumbs from his jacket and whispering something that made him giggle. The gesture was kind, almost maternal, yet Miss Marple caught a fleeting shadow in Eleanor's eyes, a flicker of something deeper, grief, perhaps, or guilt. It was then that Eleanor made her way toward Miss Marple's table, her silk dress rustling softly. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" she said, her voice warm and slightly husky. "I've heard so much about you. The village speaks of you with such fondness." Miss Marple smiled, her hands still busy with her knitting. "They're very kind to an old woman like me," she said. "And you, Mrs. Grayson, seem to have made quite an impression already." Eleanor laughed, a sound like chiming bells. "I hope it's a good one. St. Mary Mead is such a charming place. I feel I could belong here." She paused, her eyes scanning the green. "Though I confess, village life is new to me. I've spent most of my years in London." "London is quite different from St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational but her gaze keen. "But villages have their own rhythms. You'll find people here are very observant." Eleanor's smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "I'm sure they are. It's part of the charm, isn't it? Everyone knowing everyone else's business." She laughed again, though it sounded a touch forced. "I must mingle, but I do hope we'll have a chance to talk again, Miss Marple." "I'd like that very much," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking steadily. As Eleanor moved away, Miss Marple's mind began to turn. There was something in Eleanor's manner, guardedness beneath the polish, that reminded her of a case she'd encountered years ago involving a young widow who had come to St. Mary Mead with a similar air of mystery. That woman had been hiding a secret, one that had eventually unraveled with tragic consequences. Miss Marple wondered if Eleanor Grayson carried a similar burden. The tea party continued, the villagers' chatter growing louder as the sun dipped lower. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small group near the rose arbor, where Mrs. Clement was speaking animatedly to Dr. Hartley. The doctor's face was tense, his hands fidgeting with his teacup. Miss Marple couldn't hear their words, but she noted the way Mrs. Clement's smile tightened, the way Dr. Hartley glanced nervously toward Eleanor. A moment later, Eleanor joined them, and the dynamic shifted. Mrs. Clement's tone grew sharper, her gestures more abrupt. Dr. Hartley seemed to shrink slightly, his shoulders hunching as he mumbled a response. Eleanor, ever the gracious guest, smoothed the moment with a laugh and a light touch on Mrs. Clement's arm. But Miss Marple saw the strain in her eyes as the afternoon drew to a close. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. She paused by the vicarage gate, where Mrs. Clement was bidding farewell to the guests. "Such a lovely event, Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said. "You must be exhausted." "Oh, it's all worth it for the community," Mrs. Clement replied, though her smile was weary. "Though I must say, Mrs. Grayson's presence added a certain excitement." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. "She's a most interesting woman." Mrs. Clement hesitated, then leaned closer. "You know, Miss Marple, I overheard something curious today. One of the maids at Willow Cottage mentioned that Mrs. Grayson keeps a locked box in her study. She's very particular about it, apparently. Is that so?" Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind filed the detail away. "People often have their private keepsakes." "Yes, of course," Mrs. Clement said quickly. "I didn't mean to gossip. It's just, well, one does wonder about newcomers." "One does," Miss Marple agreed, her smile serene as she walked home along the winding lane to her cottage. Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. The locked box, Eleanor's guarded charm, the tensions at the tea party, all were pieces of a puzzle that had yet to take shape. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once teased her about seeing mysteries where none existed. But Miss Marple knew better. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where every glance and whisper carried meaning, mysteries were never far from the surface. That evening, as she sat by her fire with a cup of chamomile tea, Miss Marple reflected on Eleanor Grayson. The woman's charm was undeniable, but it was the kind of charm that concealed. The days following the tea party were quiet, but the ripples of Eleanor's presence continued to spread. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the village's pulse, noted the whispers that followed Eleanor wherever she went. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, remarked on the volume of letters Eleanor received, many bearing London postmarks. At the butcher's, Mr. Price mentioned that Eleanor's housekeeper had ordered an unusual amount of fine cuts, as if preparing for grand entertaining. Even the children, playing near Willow Cottage, spoke of seeing Eleanor pacing the garden at dusk, court behind the counter. "She's donated a new set of hymnals for the church." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said, selecting a tin of biscuits from the shelf. "She seems very keen to make her mark." "Oh, she's charming enough," Miss Hartnell said, her tone implying otherwise. "But I do wonder about her. A widow, all alone in that big house, with no family to speak of. It's not natural, is it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Widows often find their own way," she said, "though I imagine Mrs. Grayson must miss her husband terribly." Miss Hartnell leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's just it, Miss Marple. I heard from Mrs. Price she cleans for the vicar. You know that Mrs. Grayson never speaks of her husband, not a word. Someone mentioned him at the tea party. She went quite pale." "Did she, now?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest was piqued. "Grief can be a private thing." Miss Marple paid for her biscuits and left the shop, her mind turning over Miss Hartnell's words. The absence of mention about Eleanor's husband was curious, though not necessarily damning. Grief manifested in many ways, as Miss Marple knew from her years of observing human nature, that her charm, while captivating, was not entirely trusted. On Sunday, Eleanor was there, sitting near the front, her head bowed in apparent devotion. Dr. Hartley sat a few pews behind. his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that Miss Marple found telling. Mrs. Clement, presiding over the collection plate, cast occasional glances at Eleanor, her expression unreadable. The sermon. Miss Marple listened politely, but her attention was elsewhere. A small thing, perhaps, but Miss Marple had learned to trust such details. After the service, the congregation lingered outside the church, exchanging pleasantries. Miss Marple approached Eleanor, who was speaking with Mr. Petherick. "A lovely service, wasn't it?" Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Oh yes," Eleanor said, her voice warm but her eyes cautious. "The vicar has a way of making I feel quite uplifted." "He does," Miss Marple agreed. "And the new hymnals are a fine addition. Your generosity is much appreciated." "Are most welcome," he said. "Though I must say, St. Mary Mead is a quiet place. Not much excitement for a woman used to London's pace." "Quiet is exactly what I need," Eleanor said, her tone light but firm. "After everything." The word hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the way Eleanor's gaze flickered, as if she'd said more than intended. Mr. Petherick seemed to notice too, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he said nothing. As Miss Marple walked home, she reflected on the morning's observations. Eleanor's charm was a shield, but it was not impenetrable. The mention of her husband, however brief, had unsettled her. Miss Marple knew that secrets, like seeds, had a way of sprouting when least expected. Over the next week, Miss Marple made discreet inquiries, careful not to arouse suspicion. She visited Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, under the pretense of ordering a cake for a friend's birthday. "Mrs. Grayson must keep you busy," Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "Such a large house for one person." "Oh, she's no trouble," Mrs. Price said, dusting flour from her hands. "Keeps to herself, mostly, though she's particular about her study. Won't let me clean in there unless she's present." "That's understandable," Miss Marple said. "Some people are very private about their papers." Mrs. Price nodded, but her expression suggested she had more to say. "I've never seen her so careful about anything." Miss Marple smiled, filing the information away. "We all have our treasures," she said, and changed the subject to the merits of sponge cake versus fruit cake. Later, she called on Mrs. Bantry, the former occupant of Willow Cottage, who now lived in a smaller house near the village green. Mrs. Bantry was a cheerful, talkative woman, always eager to share a story. Over tea, Miss Marple mentioned Eleanor's arrival. "She seems to have settled in well," Miss Marple said, "though I imagine Willow Cottage must feel quite different for her." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "It's a lovely house, but it's got its quirks. That study, for instance, always so drafty. I used to keep my old letters in there, but I never needed to lock them up." "No need to lock up in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said, her tone light, "though I suppose newcomers bring their own habits." Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed. "Oh, she's a mystery, that one. Did you know she had a visitor the other day? A man, not from around here, looked like a city type, all sharp suit and sharper eyes." "Did he?" Now Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained placid. "Perhaps a friend from London." "Perhaps," Mrs. Bantry said, clearly unconvinced. "But he didn't stay long. I saw him leaving Willow Cottage in a huff, and Mrs. Grayson looked positively shaken. A mysterious visitor, a locked box, a widow who avoided mention of her husband. These were threads in a tapestry that was still forming." She recalled a case from her youth, A woman in St. Mary Mead who had kept a locked diary, its contents revealing a betrayal that had shaken the village. As the days passed, Miss Marple continued to observe. She noted Dr. Hartley's frequent visits to Willow Cottage, ostensibly to check on Eleanor's health, though his lingering glances suggested a deeper interest. She saw Mrs. Clement's increasing coolness toward Eleanor, her smiles growing thinner with each encounter. Her reasons for choosing St. Mary Mead. One evening, as Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting a shawl for her niece, she heard footsteps on the lane. It was Dr. Hartley, his face pale in the moonlight. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "Good evening, Dr. Hartley," she replied, her needles pausing. "A fine night for a walk." He hesitated, then nodded. I was just coming from Willow Cottage. Mrs. Grayson isn't feeling well." "I'm sorry to hear that," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "Nothing serious, I hope." No, he said quickly. "Just a headache, but she's under a lot of strain." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "New places can be overwhelming," she said, "and new people, too." Dr. Hartley nodded, his expression troubled. "She's a remarkable woman, Miss Marple, but I worry about her. There are things she doesn't talk about." Miss Marple smiled, her voice kind but firm. "People often keep their troubles to themselves, Dr. Hartley, but they have a way of coming to light." He looked at her, as if weighing whether to say more, then tipped his hat and continued down the lane. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts turning to Eleanor Grayson. The woman's charm was a beacon, drawing people in, but it was also a veil, concealing something that Miss Marple was determined to uncover. As she returned to her knitting, the village clock chimed 10, its sound echoing through the still night. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, each stitch a step closer to unraveling the mystery of Eleanor. Quiet observations, weaving together the subtle clues she gathers from the villagers' interactions with Eleanor. She notes the growing tension between Eleanor and Mrs. Clement, whose initial admiration has turned to suspicion. Dr. Hartley's protectiveness toward Eleanor deepens. The solicitor remains a quiet observer, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Miss Marple recalls similar patterns from past cases, drawing parallels to human nature's tendency to hide guilt or fear behind a polished exterior. The narrative explores the village's dynamics, with Miss Marple's gentle inquiries revealing more about Eleanor's past, a hint of scandal, a suggestion of financial secrecy, and the shadow of her late husband's death. The chapter builds toward a pivotal moment at th. Chapter 3. The unexpected guest. The late summer sun cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, painting the cobblestone lanes and thatched roofs with a golden hue. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window of her modest cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink shawl. The village, usually a haven of predictable routines, buzzed with an unusual energy, one that Miss Marple's keen senses had already detected. The arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson at Willow Cottage had stirred curiosity, but it was the newcomer's guarded demeanor that truly piqued Miss Marple's interest. Today, however, a new ripple disturbed the village's stranger had arrived, and Miss Marple, ever observant, sensed that his presence would unravel something deeper. The morning had begun like any other. Miss Marple, after tending to her roses, nodding politely to neighbors, and pausing to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Price at the post office. It was there, amid the clatter of sorting letters. Her eyes, bright with the thrill of fresh gossip, leaned over the counter and whispered, "A gentleman arrived on the morning train, Miss Marple. A Mr. Victor Langston, or so he says." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind sharpened. "How curious," she murmured, adjusting her straw hat. "And what sort of man is he?" Mrs. Price's voice dropped lower. "Oh, quite the charmer, if you ask me. Well-dressed mid-40s, with a smile that could sell you the moon. But there's something about him shifty, like he's looking for more than he's letting on." A stranger inquiring about Eleanor Grayson was no small matter, especially given the whispers about the widow's past. Eleanor had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a month ago, her elegant manners and generous donations to the church winning over many, but not all. The village's new physician seemed oddly reserved in her presence. Miss Marple, who had a knack for noticing what others missed, had already sensed undercurrents of unease at the village tea party 2 days prior. Now, this Mr. Langston's arrival added a new thread to the tapestry she was beginning to weave by noon. Miss Marple had settled into the village hall, where the Women's Institute was preparing for the upcoming harvest festival. She sat in a corner, her knitting a perfect excuse for her quiet observation. The hall was a flurry of activity, Mrs. Clement directing volunteers with her usual brisk efficiency, Miss Weatherby arranging flowers, and young Betty from the bakery delivering trays of scones. The air smelled of polished wood and fresh roses. Admitting a man she instinctively knew was Victor Langston, he was, as Mrs. Price had described, impeccably dressed. His face, tanned and lined just enough to suggest a life of experience, carried a smile that was both warm and calculated. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on each face as if cataloguing them. When his gaze met Miss Marple's, she offered a polite nod, her fingers never pausing in their knitting. He approached Mrs. Clement, who was arranging hymnals on a table. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak. "I'm Victor Langston, a visitor to your charming village." "Mrs. Clement, I was hoping to learn more about St. Mary Mead, perhaps about a friend of mine, Mrs. Eleanor Grayson." Mrs. Clement's smile was tight, her eyes narrowing slightly.
"Oh,
"I'm not sure there's much to tell." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Mrs. Clement's tone was polite, but edged with something colder disapproval, perhaps, or suspicion. Victor Langston, undeterred, leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Oh, I'm sure there's more too. A fine man, Charles Grayson. Tragic, what happened to him. If you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." She turned away, leaving Victor standing alone, his smile faltering. For a moment before he recovered and moved toward Miss Weatherby, who was more than happy to chat, Miss Marple watched this exchange with interest. Victor Langston's mention of Eleanor's husband had struck a nerve, and Mrs. Clement's reaction suggested more than mere dislike. The vicar's wife was known for her piety, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that piety could mask a multitude of motives. She made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Clement later, perhaps over tea, where a gentle question or two might loosen her tongue. The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple remained at the village hall, her presence unassuming, yet ever present. She listened as Victor Langston worked his way through the room, charming Miss Weatherby with stories of London and coaxing a laugh from Betty with a compliment on her scones. But his questions always circled back to Eleanor Grayson, her habits, her friends, her finances, the way her smile had wavered when Dr. Hartley mentioned her husband's death. Now, this stranger's probing suggested he knew something, or wanted something, that Eleanor was not eager to share. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the hall's windows, Miss Marple decided it was time to visit Willow Cottage. She packed her knitting into her worn tapestry bag and set off, her steps slow but purposeful. The cottage, a charming stone building with climbing roses, stood at the edge of the village, its garden meticulously tended. Eleanor Grayson was in the front garden, pruning a rosebush, her movements precise but her expression distant. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her face softening into a smile. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," Eleanor said, setting down her shears. Her voice was warm, but her eyes held a flicker of wariness. "Would you like some tea? I've just put the kettle on." Over tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward general village matters, carefully avoiding any mention of Victor Langston. She spoke of the Harvest Festival, the vicar's latest sermon, and the new roses in her own garden. Eleanor responded politely, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her posture, the way her fingers tightened around her teacup when the conversation drifted toward her past. "You've settled in so well," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "It must be a comfort to find such a peaceful place after everything." Eleanor's smile faltered. "Yes, St. Mary Mead is a change from London. I needed somewhere quiet after Charles's passing." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes soft but watchful. "Loss is never easy," she said. "People can be so curious, can't they? Always asking questions." Eleanor's gaze flickered to the window, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might say more, but the moment passed, and Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt. "I should finish the roses before it gets dark," she said. "Thank you for the visit, Miss Marple." Miss Marple took her leave, her mind turning over the conversation. Eleanor's reluctance to discuss her husband was not unexpected, but it confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that the widow was hiding something. As she walked back through the village, the evening air cool against her skin, she resolved to keep a closer eye on Willow Cottage and on Victor Langston that evening. The village hall hosted a small gathering to discuss the harvest festival's final arrangements. Miss Marple, invited as a courtesy, took her usual place in a corner, her knitting a familiar shield. The room was filled with familiar faces: Mrs. Clement, Miss Weatherby, Dr. Hartley, and a few others, but all eyes turned when Victor Langston entered, accompanied by Eleanor Grayson herself. The widow looked radiant in a deep green dress, her smile bright but brittle. Victor, at her side, exuded confidence, his arm brushing hers in a way that suggested familiarity. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched them. Eleanor's posture was stiff, her laughter a touch too forced. Victor, meanwhile, seemed to revel in the attention, his voice carrying as he complimented the village's charm and hinted at his long acquaintance with Eleanor's late husband. The other villagers responded with polite interest, but Miss Marple noted the undercurrents: Mrs. Clement's tight-lipped smile, Dr. Hartley's furrowed brow, and Miss Weatherby's eager questions about Victor's travels. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple slipped out to the hall's small kitchen, ostensibly to help with the tea, but really to position herself near the back door. Sure enough, as the meeting wound down, she glimpsed two figures slipping outside Delanor and Victor. Their voices were low, but the night air carried fragments. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her face serene but her thoughts anything but. She recalled a case from her youth, a quiet village not unlike St. Mary Mead, where a charming stranger had arrived with questions and left in a coffin. The parallels were striking, and Miss Marple knew that Victor Langston's presence in St. Mary Mead was no coincidence. As she watched Eleanor rejoin the gathering, her charm once again in place, Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring. A puzzle was forming, and she was determined to solve it. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her mind still on the previous night's overheard conversation. The innkeeper, Mr. Dobbs, was an old friend, and Miss Marple knew he would be a font of information. Armed with a basket of homemade jam as a pretext, she made her way to the inn, her steps light despite the weight of her thoughts. Mr. Dobbs greeted her warmly, his round face breaking into a smile. "Miss Marple, what a treat. Come to check on my roses, have you?" She laughed, handing him the jam. "Oh, I couldn't resist bringing you a little something. And I hear you have a new guest, Mr. Langston, is it? He seems quite the character." Mr. Dobbs's smile faded slightly. "Aye, he's a smooth talker, that one. Been asking all sorts of questions about Mrs. Grayson, her habits, her visitors, even her finances. Not sure I like the look of him." To be honest, Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "People do get curious about newcomers, don't they? Has he mentioned why he's here?" "Not in so many words," Mr. Dobbs said, lowering his voice. "But he's got a way of asking that makes you think he already knows the answers. Said he was a friend of Mrs. Grayson's husband, but I reckon there's more to it. He's got a locked case in his room, heavy by the look of it. Papers, maybe." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind turning over this new piece of information. A locked case suggested Victor was carrying something important, evidence, perhaps, or documents related to Eleanor's past. She resolved to keep an eye on him, perhaps even to contrive a way to see inside that case. Over the next few days, Victor Langston became a fixture in St. Mary Mead, his charm winning over some villagers while raising suspicions among others. He attended church on Sunday, sitting near Eleanor and exchanging polite nods with the vicar. He joined the men at the Blue Boar for a pint, his stories of London and abroad drawing laughter and admiration. But Miss Marple, watching from her quiet corner, noted the way his eyes darted to Eleanor whenever she was near. The way his smile tightened when Dr. Hartley spoke to her. Dr. Hartley, too, was behaving oddly. The young doctor, usually cheerful and open, had grown withdrawn, his eyes often lingering on Eleanor with a mix of concern and something deeper. Miss Marple, who had seen such looks before, suspected he was in love with her, or at least infatuated. But there was more to it, she thought. His nervousness around Victor suggested he knew something, or feared something, about the stranger's intentions. On the third day of Victor's visit, Miss Marple contrived to meet him herself. She encountered him on the village green, where he was admiring the ancient oak tree that marked the center of St. Mary Mead. "Good morning, Mr. Langston," she said, her voice mild. "You're finding our little village to your liking, I hope." He turned, his smile as polished as ever. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Oh, I'm quite taken with St. Mary Mead. It's the perfect place to rest and to reconnect with old friends." She nodded, her eyes twinkling. Mrs. Grayson must be pleased to see a familiar face. It's not easy settling into a new place after a loss. Victor's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Eleanor's a strong woman, he said. She's had to be, after what happened to Charles. A terrible business. That yes, terrible, Miss Marple agreed, her tone soft, but probing. You were close to him, I understand. Oh, very close, Victor said, his voice smooth. We had business dealings. I like to think I'm honoring his memory by checking on Eleanor. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. In her lap. How kind of you, she said. It's so important to have friends in times of need. They parted ways, but Miss Marple's mind was alight with suspicion. Victor's words were too carefully chosen, his manner too practiced. She thought of the locked case Mr. Dobbs had mentioned, of Victor's heated words to Eleanor, and of the widow's guarded demeanor. Something was amiss, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it that evening. As she sat by her fire, knitting and thinking, Miss Marple recalled a story from her youth, a tale of a charming man who had come to a village much like this one, asking questions and stirring trouble. He had been a blackmailer, preying on a widow's secrets, and his end had been as sudden as it was violent. The parallels were striking, and Miss Marple felt a chill despite the warmth of her cottage. Victor Langston was no mere visitor, and Eleanor Grayson was no ordinary widow. The truth, she sensed, was closened. It would not be pleasant. As the days passed, the village's curiosity about Victor grew, but so did its unease. Whispers followed him, and Eleanor's name was often mentioned in the same breath. Miss Marple, ever patient, continued her quiet observations, her knitting a constant companion. She spoke with Mrs. Clement, who remained tight-lipped about Eleanor, but let slip that Victor had visited the vicarage, asking about charitable donations. She chatted with Dr. Hartley, whose nervous glances confirmed her suspicion that he knew more than he was saying, and she kept a close eye on Willow Cottage, where Eleanor's lights burned late into the night. On the 5th day of Victor's visit, Miss Marple received an invitation to a dinner at Willow Cottage. Eleanor, it seemed, was determined to cement her place in the village, and a lavish gathering was her way of doing so. Miss Marple accepted, knowing that such an event would bring tensions to the surface. She prepared carefully, choosing a simple gray dress that made her appear even more unassuming, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The dinner was a grand affair, with Eleanor at her most charming. The table was set with fine china and silver, the menu a testament to her wealth and taste. Among the guests were Mrs. Clement, Dr. Hartley, Miss Weatherby, Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, and, of course, Victor Langston. Miss Marple, seated near the end of the table, watched as Victor dominated the conversation, his stories drawing laughter, but his eyes always returning to Eleanor. Eleanor, for her part, played the perfect hostess, but Miss Marple noted the strain in her smile, the way her hand trembled as she poured wine. Dr. Hartley was quiet, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Mrs. Clement's remarks carried a sharp edge. Mr. Petherick, usually reserved for something, as the evening drew to a close. Miss Marple slipped into the garden for a breath of air, her knitting bag still in hand. The night was cool, the stars bright above Willow Cottage. She paused by the rose bushes, her ears attuned to the sounds of the house. It was then that she heard it, a low, urgent voice from the shadows. You can't keep me quiet forever, Eleanor. Victor was saying, his tone cold. I have proof, and I'll use it, unless you pay. Eleanor's voice was barely audible, but the fear in it was clear. Please, Victor, I don't have what you're asking for. You don't understand. Understand perfectly, he cut in. You thought you could run from it, but I found you, and I'll keep finding you until you give me what I'm owed. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, her heart pounding. The conversation ended as Victor strode back into the house, leaving Eleanor alone in the garden, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple waited, her mind racing. Victor's words confirmed her suspicion. He was blackmailing Eleanor, and the secret he held was tied to her husband's death. But what was it, and how far would he push her? The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a shock. Victor Langston was found dead in Willow Cottage's garden. His body sprawled among the roses, a glass of wine spilled beside him. The village doctor, summoned in haste, confirmed poisoning likely from the wine, which had a bitter aftertaste. Suspicion fell immediately on Eleanor Grayson, who had hosted the dinner and poured the wine. The village buzzed with gossip, and Mrs. Clement's voice was loudest, hinting darkly at Eleanor's past. Miss Marple, however, was not so quick to judge. As she sat in her cottage, knitting and thinking, charm, Eleanor might have a secret, but Miss Marple doubted she was a murderer. There was another hand at work here, someone who had seen Victor as a threat or an opportunity, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unshakable resolve, was determined to find them. The days that followed were tense, with the police questioning Eleanor and searching Willow Cottage. Miss Marple, undeterred, continued her own investigation, her knitting needles clicking as she pieced together the puzzle. She thought of Mrs. Clement's coldness, Dr. Hartley's nervousness, and Mr. Petherick's sudden interest in Victor. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple was skilled at weaving them together as she walked through the village, her eyes sharp behind her gentle smile. Miss Marple knew that the truth was close. Victor Langston's death was no accident, and Eleanor Grayson's charm, so carefully cultivated, was a mask for a deeper pain. The unexpected guest had brought trouble to St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple was ready to meet it, her mind as sharp as ever, her heart steady with the certainty that justice would prevail. Chapter 4. A Shadow of Doubt. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and quaint cottages that lined the village's main thoroughfare. Willow Cottage, with its ivy-clad walls and neatly trimmed rose bushes, stood as the centerpiece of the evening's attention. Eleanor Grayson, the enigmatic widow who had taken up residence there, was hosting a dinner party, an event that had stirred the village's curiosity to a fever pitch. Invitations had been extended to a select group of St. Mary Mead's most prominent residents, and though Miss Jane Marple had received hers as a matter of courtesy, nonetheless she accepted with her usual quiet grace, her sharp eyes already anticipating the undercurrents that such gatherings inevitably revealed. Miss Marple arrived at Willow Cottage promptly at 7, her modest black handbag tucked under one arm and her knitting bag dangling from the other. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the garden, and the soft hum of conversation greeted her as she stepped through the front door. The cottage's interior was as elegant as its exterior promised, with polished oak floors, delicate lace curtains, and a chandelier that cast a warm golden glow over the dining room. Eleanor had spared no expense, it seemed, in transforming the once humble cottage into a stage for her social debut. Eleanor herself stood at the center of the room, radiant in a deep emerald gown that complemented her auburn hair. Her smile was warm, her gestures practiced, as she welcomed her guests with an ease that bordered on theatrical. To Miss Marple, who observed from the edge of the room, facade that invited admiration but deflected scrutiny. The other guests, Dr. Hartley, the young village physician with his earnest demeanor, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose prim smile barely masked her disapproval, Mr. Petherick, the local solicitor, with his sharp eyes and sharper tongue, and a handful of other local notables mingled with varying degrees of enthusiasm, settled into a corner near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. It was a strategic position, one that allowed her to observe the room without drawing attention to herself. Her eyes, bright and unassuming behind her spectacles, darted from face to face, noting the subtle interplay of glances, the hesitations in speech, the fleeting expressions that betrayed more than words ever could. She had always found that people revealed themselves most clearly when they thought no one was watching, and tonight she sensed there was much to be revealed. Eleanor's guest of honor, if one could call him that, was Victor Langston, the stranger, who had arrived in St. Mary Mead only days before, claiming a connection to Eleanor's late husband. Victor was a man of striking presence, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and a smile that was both disarming and faintly predatory. He moved through the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, his tailored suit and polished shoes marking him as an outsider in the village's more modest milieu. To the untrained eye, he was the epitome of charm, his anecdotes drawing laughter and his compliments eliciting blushes. But to Miss Marple, there was something unsettling in his manner, a touch too smooth, a glance too calculating. She had seen men like him before, in her youth and in her travels, men who wielded charm like a weapon, concealing motives that were rarely benign. As the guests were ushered to the dining table, the table was set with fine china and silver, the centerpiece a cascade of white roses that seemed almost too perfect for the occasion. Light, inconsequential topics, the weather, the upcoming church bazaar, the merits of the local bakery's scones. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed a tension, a current of unease that rippled through the room like a draft through an open window. Victor, seated to Eleanor's right, was in fine form, regaling the table with tales of his travels abroad. His stories were vivid, filled with exotic locales and improbable adventures, and the other guests listened with rapt attention. But Miss Marple noticed that Eleanor's smile grew tighter with each anecdote, her fingers gripping her wineglass a fraction too tightly. When Victor made a passing reference to her late husband, Charles Grayson, Eleanor's composure faltered for a moment, her eyes flickering with something that might have been furor guilt. Charles was always such a generous man, Victor said, his voice smooth as silk. I remember how he'd open his home to friends, no matter their station. A rare quality, don't you think, Eleanor? Eleanor's smile was brittle. Yes, he was. Mrs. Clement, asking about the vicar's latest sermon, and the conversation shifted. But Miss Marple filed the moment away, her mind already turning over the implications. There was history here, she thought, and not the kind that was easily forgotten. As the meal progressed, roast lamb with rosemary, new potatoes, and a delicate asparagus soup, Miss Marple continued her silent vigil. She noted how Dr. Hartley, seated across from Eleanor, seemed to watch her with an intensity that went beyond professional concern. His young face, usually open and earnest, was clouded with something like worry, and he spoke little, his responses to questions curt and distracted. Mrs. Clement. He spoke as if weighing his every word. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, was more reserved, his comments dry and precise, but Miss Marple caught the way his gaze lingered on Eleanor, as if assessing her worth or her secrets. The dessert course was just being. Victor, leaning back in his chair with a glass of port in hand, made another remark about Charles Grayson, this time with a hint of insinuation. "It's such a pity, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the table's attention. "A man like Charles, cut down in his prime. One wonders what might have been if circumstances had been different." The room fell silent, the clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation stilled. Eleanor's face paled, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. For a moment it seemed she might respond, but instead she set her fork down and rose from her chair. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice steady but strained, "I need to check on something in the kitchen." As Eleanor left the room, Victor's smile widened, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Miss Marple's knitting needles slowed, her mind racing. There was no mistaking it. Now Victor was baiting Eleanor, probing for a reaction, and he was succeeding. Miss Marple glanced at the other guests, noting their reactions. Dr. Hartley's jaw was tight, his hands clenched on the table. Mrs. Clement's lips were pursed, her disapproval palpable. Mr. Petherick, however, merely raised an eyebrow, as if filing the moment away for future reference. The rest of the dinner passed without further incident, though the atmosphere remained strained. But Miss Marple could not shake the sense that something was amiss, that the evening's tensions were a prelude to something far more serious. As the guests began to take their leave, she lingered, offering to help Eleanor clear the tabula gesture that was both kind and calculated. "Thank you, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her smile warm but weary. "You're too kind." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, stacking plates with practiced ease. "It's been a lovely evening. You've done wonders with the cottage." Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. "I'm trying to make it my own," she said, her voice soft. "It's not always easy starting over." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. "I imagine it isn't," she said, "but you seem to have a knack for it. And such interesting company tonight, Mr. Langston, for instance. Quite a character." "An old acquaintance," she said carefully. "I hadn't expected to see him here." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, her eyes fixed on her work. "He seems very fond of reminiscing," she said lightly. "It's curious how the past has a way of following us, isn't it?" Eleanor did not reply, and Miss Marple did not press her. Instead, she bid her hostess good night and made her way back to her own cottage, her mind buzzing with observations. Victor Langston was no mere acquaintance, she was certain of it. His presence in St. Mary Mead was no coincidence, and his remarks about Charles Grayson were not idle chatter. There was a purpose behind his words, a motive that Miss Marple could only guess at for now. But she had seen enough to know that Eleanor Grayson was a woman with secret sand, that Victor Langston was determined to unearth them. The village was quiet, as Miss Marple walked home, the stars bright overhead and the air cool against her skin. She thought of the dinner, of the glances exchanged and the words left unsaid. She thought of Eleanor's strained smile, of Victor's PR. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a tragedy that would shake the village to its core. Victor Langston was found dead in the garden of Willow Cottage. His body sprawled among the rose bushes, a glass of port shattered beside him. The cause of death was quickly determined to be poison, a fast-acting toxin that had left no time for struggle or protest. The news spread like wildfire, carried by whispers in the post office, the bakery, and the churchyard. Eleanor Grayson, the gracious hostess of the previous evening, was now the subject of suspicion, her charm and poise overshadowed by the specter of murder. Miss Marple, sitting in her parlor with a cup of tea, listened to the gossip brought by her daily help, Mrs. Price. The village was divided. It seemed some believed Eleanor was guilty, her mysterious past proof of her capacity for violence. Others thought her too refined, too delicate to commit such a crime. Miss Marple said little, her mind already turning over the events of the previous evening. She thought of Victor's insinuating remarks, of Eleanor's unease, of the glances exchanged among the guests, and she thought of a case from her youth long ago, when a charming stranger had met a similar fate, his death the result of secrets too dangerous to keep. As the village buzzed with speculation, Miss Marple set her teacup down and reached for her knitting. There was work to be done, she thought, questions to ask, connections to uncover. Victor Langston's death was no accident, and Eleanor Grayson was at the heart of it, whether as victim or perpetrator. Miss Marple did not yet know which, but she was determined to find out. For now, she would watch and listen, her quiet presence a balm to the village's unease, her sharp mind already piecing together the puzzle of a shadow of doubt that had fallen over St. Mary Mead. The days that followed were filled with a flurry of activity. The local police, led by Inspector Craddock, descended on Willow Cottage, their questions polite but pointed. Eleanor, pale but composed, answered them with the same grace she had shown at the dinner party, her responses vague but not evasive. The villagers, meanwhile, gathered in knots at the post office and the tea shop, their theories growing wilder with each retelling. Some whispered of a lover's quarrel gone wrong, others of a fortune in dispute. Mrs. Clement, ever the voice of moral authority, declared that Eleanor's past must hold the key, her tone implying that no good could come of a woman who kept such secrets. Miss Marple, as was her habit, kept her own counsel. She attended the village sewing circle, her needles clicking steadily as she listened to the chatter around her. She visited the church to help arrange flowers for Sunday service, her ears attuned to the hushed conversations of the other volunteers. And she paid a call on Dr. Hartley, ostensibly to inquire about a minor ailment, but in truth to gauge his mood. The young doctor was distracted, his usual warmth tempered by a nervous energy that Miss Marple found telling. When she mentioned Victor's death in passing, his face tightened, and he changed the subject with an abruptness that confirmed her suspicions. Dr. Hartley knew more than he was saying. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had formed a clearer picture of the events leading up to Victor's death. She had learned, through discreet inquiries, that Victor had been seen in the village pub the day before the dinner, asking questions about Eleanor's finances and her late husband's estate. She had overheard, at the sewing circle, a rumor that Victor had visited Mr. Petherick's office, though the solicitor had been tight-lipped about the purpose of the meeting, and she had noted, during her visit to Dr. Hartley, a photograph on his desk, a faded image of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor. Though the doctor had quickly tucked it away when he saw her looking, these fragments, like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind. Victor Langston had not come to St. Mary Mead by chance. He had come with a purpose, one that involved Eleanor Grayson and her past. His death, she was certain, was no random act, but the culmination of a chain of events that stretched back to a time before Eleanor had set foot in the village. The question was not only who had killed him, but why, and what truth they were so desperate to keep hidden. As the sun set over St. Mary Mead, casting its golden light across the village green, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She thought of Eleanor, of the weight she carried behind her charming facade. She thought of Victor, whose charm had been a mask for something darker. And she thought of the village itself, with its quiet beauty and its hidden currents of greed, fear, and betrayal. The truth, she knew, was close at hand, waiting to be uncovered by a mind patient enough to see it. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming manner and her unerring instinct for human nature, was just the person to do it. The investigation into Victor's death took on a new urgency as the days passed. Inspector Craddock, a competent but unimaginative officer, focused his attention on Eleanor, his questions growing sharper with each visit to Willow Cottage. The villagers, sensing blood in the water, began to distance themselves from the widow, their invitations drying up and their greetings becoming curt. Even Mrs. Clement, who had once praised Eleanor's generosity to the church, now spoke of her with a pitying air, as if her guilt were a foregone conclusion. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily swayed. She had seen too many cases where appearances deceived, where the obvious suspect was merely a convenient scapegoat. She continued her quiet rounds, her presence so familiar that few thought to question it. At the post office, she chatted with the postmistress about the weather, subtly steering the conversation toward Victor's movements in the days before his death. At the tea shop, she listened as the owner recounted a heated exchange between Victor and Mr. Petherick, overheard by a customer. And at the church, she helped Mrs. Clement sort hymnals, noting the older woman's nervous fidgeting whenever Eleanor's name was mentioned. By the time the inquest was held, dinner party, Miss Marple had gathered enough to form a hypothesis, though she kept it to herself. The inquest, held in the village hall, was a somber affair, with the coroner delivering a verdict of death by poisoning and the police promising a thorough investigation. Eleanor, dressed in mourning black, sat through the proceedings with a calm that some interpreted as coldness, others as courage. Miss Marple, seated at the back, watched not Eleanor but the other attendees, Dr. Hartley, whose hands trembled slightly, Mr. Petherick, whose face was a mask of professional detachment, Mrs. Clement, whose pious expression seemed to waver under scrutiny after the inquest. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. She thought of a case from her youth in the village of Much Benham, where a charming newcomer had been poisoned after threatening to reveal a secret. The parallels were striking, though the details differed. In that case, the killer had been a woman driven to desperation by the threat of exposure. Her crime one of passion rather than calculation. Was Eleanor such a woman? Player in this drama, someone whose motives were less obvious but no less deadly. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes lingering on the distant silhouette of Willow Cottage. The shadow of doubt that hung over St. Mary Mead was growing darker, she thought, and it would take all her skill to pierce it. But pierce it she would, for the truth, however harsh, had a way of coming to light in the end. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and her unyielding curiosity, was determined to see it done. The village settled into an uneasy routine in the days that followed, the shock of Victor's death giving way to a muted tension. Eleanor kept to herself, her outings limited to brief visits to the shops or the church. Her face pale but composed, Dr. Hartley threw himself into his work, his visits to patients brisk and efficient, though Miss Marple noted the strain in his eyes. Mrs. Clement, meanwhile, seemed to revel in her role as the village's moral arbiter, her sermons on sin and redemption taking on a pointed edge, and Mr. Petherick, ever the observer, watched it all with a detachment that Miss Marple found intriguing. Through it all, Miss Marple continued her quiet inquiries, her conversations light but purposeful, her observations keen. She visited the library ostensibly to borrow a book, but in truth to speak with the librarian who had seen Victor and Eleanor together in the village square. She called on the vicar, Mr. Clement, to discuss the church bazaar, steering the conversation toward his wife's recent preoccupation. And she paid another visit to Dr. Hartley, this time with a question about a prescription, though her real aim was to gauge his reaction to a mention of Eleanor's past. Each encounter added a piece to the puzzle, a thread to the tapestry of suspicion that was forming in Miss Marple's mind. She thought of Eleanor's strained smile at the dinner party, of Victor's insinuating remarks, of the glances exchanged among the guests. She thought of the poison so carefully administered, and of the secrets that might drive someone to such an act. And she thought of St. Mary Mead, with its quiet beauty and its hidden depths, a place where charm could mask a multitude of sins, but not forever. As the sun set on another day, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting once again in hand. The village was waiting, she knew, for the truth to emerge, and she, with her unassuming manner and her sharp insight. Chapter 5. The Village Whispers. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest drawing-room in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue baby blanket for a distant cousin's newborn. The village was anything but calm, however, as the news of Victor Langston's death in Willow Cottage's garden had spread like wildfire, igniting gossip and suspicion among the residents. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, though fixed on her knitting, were attuned to the undercurrents of the village's mood, and her mind was already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that Victor's death presented. The village square, usually a place of cheerful exchanges and market-day bustle, had taken on a hushed, almost conspiratorial air. Women gathered in small knots outside the post office, their voices low but urgent, while men lingered longer than usual at the Blue Boar, their pints forgotten as they debated the tragedy. Eleanor Grayson, the wealthy widow who had so recently arrived in St. Mary Mead, was at the center of it all. Her polished charm, which had initially won over many, now seemed to some a calculated mask, hiding a darker truth. whispers of her mysterious past, her sudden wealth, her late husband's untimely death, had taken on a sinister edge in light of Victor's poisoning. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be swayed by gossip alone. She had seen too many village scandals unfold to trust the tide of public opinion without scrutiny. As she sipped her morning tea, brought to her by her loyal but somewhat scatterbrained maid, Cherry, she reflected on a case from her youth, one that bore an eerie resemblance to the present situation. It had been a quiet affair in a neighboring village, where a charming guest at a country house had been found dead, poisoned by a dose of arsenic slipped into his wine. The villagers had been quick to blame the hostess, a young widow with a fortune. But Miss Marple, even then a keen observer, had noted the small inconsistencies, the way the butler's hands trembled when serving, the fleeting glance between two guests that pointed to a different culprit. In the end, it was a jealous lover, not the widow, who had done the deed, driven by a mix of greed and desperation. The memory lingered, sharp and clear, and Miss Marple wondered if St. Mary Mead was witnessing a similar misdirection. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. It was time to take her morning walk, a ritual that allowed her to observe the village without seeming to pry. She donned her straw hat, adjusted her gloves, and stepped out into the crisp air, her stick tapping lightly on the cobblestones. The village was alive with activity, though the usual cheer was tempered by unease. As she passed the post office, she caught snippets of conversation from Mrs. Price, the postmistress, who was holding court with a small group of women. "Mark my words," Mrs. Price was saying, her voice carrying a note of righteous indignation. "There's something not right about that Mrs. Grayson. Moving here with all her fine clothes and that big house, and now this man dead in her garden. It's not natural, I tell you." Mrs. Weatherby, the butcher's wife, nodded vigorously. "My Tom says he saw her arguing with that Langston fellow the day before he died. Right in the lane behind Willow Cottage, they were, and she looked fit to kill." Miss Marple paused, pretending to adjust her hat, and listened. The accusation was not Nugasip, had a way of recycling itself, but the detail about the argument was worth noting. She filed it away, her expression serene, and continued her walk toward the vicarage, where she hoped to find Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who had been notably tense at Eleanor's dinner party. The vicarage garden was a riot of color, with roses climbing the trellis and lavender buzzing with bees. Mrs. Clement was there, pruning with more force than necessary, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her face softening into a strained smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, setting down her shears. "I suppose you've heard the dreadful news about Mr. Langston." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but probing. "Such a shock for the village. I understand you knew him slightly." Mrs. Clement's hands twitched, and she busied herself with a stray leaf, only from the dinner at Willow Cottage. "He seemed charming, but perhaps too charming, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but watchful. "Yes, charm can be a curious thing. It draws people in, but it can also hide so much. I suppose Mrs. Grayson must be dreadfully upset, having him die in her garden." Mrs. Clement's smile faltered. "I suppose so, though she's kept to herself since it happened. Not that I blame her, with everyone talking." The conversation drifted to safer topics: charity, bazaars, The church roof fund, but Miss Marple noted the vicar's wife's unease, the way her eyes darted toward Willow Cottage in the distance. There was something there, a thread to tug. But Miss Marple knew better than to pull too hard too soon. Her next stop was the village shop, where young Miss Lucy Bell, the shopgirl, was sweeping the doorstep. Lucy was a bright, observant girl, and Miss Marple had often found her a useful source of unfiltered village news. She greeted Lucy with a warm smile and purchased a small tin of biscuits. "Langston, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her tone inviting confidence. "I hear he was quite a figure, always asking questions." Lucy's eyes widened, and she leaned closer, her broom forgotten. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. He was in here the day he arrived, buying tobacco and asking all sorts about Mrs. Grayson, where her money came from, who her husband was. I thought it a bit nosy, to be honest." "Did he, now?" Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "And what did you tell him?" "Not much," Lucy admitted. "I said she was a widow, came from London, and that's all I knew. But he kept pressing, like he was fishing for something." Miss Marple thanked Lucy and left, her mind turning over the new information. Victor Langston had been digging into Eleanor's past, and not subtly. It suggested a purpose beyond mere curiosity, perhaps. Blackmail, as she had begun to suspect. The thought brought her back to that long-ago case, where the poisoner had been a man with a similar knack for uncovering secrets, using them to extract money until his victim turned on him. Could Eleanor have reached such a breaking point? Or was there another player in this drama, someone who saw Victor as a threat? By midday, Miss Marple had returned home, her walk having yielded more questions than answers. "We're far from the baby blanket." The village's whispers painted Eleanor as the villain. But Miss Marple knew that gossip was often a distorted mirror, reflecting fears more than facts. She recalled Eleanor's demeanor at the dinner party, polished, yes, but with a faint tremor in her voice when Victor spoke, a shadow in her eyes when her late husband was mentioned. There was pain there, and perhaps fear, but murder? Miss Marple wasn't so sure. The afternoon brought a visitor, Mrs. Bantry, her old friend from Chipping Cleghorn, who arrived in a flurry of excitement, her hat slightly askew. Mrs. Bantry was a woman of boundless energy and a penchant for drama, and she wasted no time in launching into the topic of the day. "Jane, it's simply ghastly," she exclaimed, settling onto the sofa with a cup of tea. "That poor man, poisoned in Eleanor Grayson's garden. Everyone's saying she did it, you know. They say she's got a past, something shady about her husband's death. What do you think?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "I think, Dolly, that people are quick to judge a newcomer, especially one with a bit of mystery about her. But I wonder if Mr. Langston's death might have more to do with his own actions than Mrs. Grayson's." Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "You've got that look, Jane. You're on to something, aren't you? Come on, tell me." Miss Marple chuckled. "I'm only thinking, Dolly. Mr. Langston was asking a great many questions about Mrs. Grayson, it seems." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You think he was blackmailing her? Oh, Jane, that's positively thrilling. But who do you suppose poisoned him? Eleanor, to shut him up, or someone else?" "I'm not sure yet," Miss Marple admitted, "but I do think there's more to this than meets the eye. People in St. Mary Mead are very good at keeping up appearances, but appearances can be deceiving." Mrs. Bantry stayed for another hour, speculating wildly and pressing Miss Marple for details. But Miss Marple remained circumspect, offering only vague hints of her thoughts. After her friend left, she turned her attention to her knitting, her mind working as steadily as her needles. Victor Langston's death was no random act, she was certain. Quickness of his demise suggested premeditation. Someone who knew his habits and had access to his food or drink. Eleanor was the obvious suspect, given the location and her connection to Victor. But Miss Marple's instincts told her the truth lay deeper, tangled in the web of village relationships. The next day, Miss Marple attended the weekly sewing circle. At the village hall, a gathering that was as much about gossip as it was about needlework. The room was abuzz with talk of the murder, and Eleanor's name was on every tongue. Mrs. Price, her arms crossed, declared that Eleanor had the... Yet, amidst the chatter, Miss Marple noticed something curious. Mrs. Clement, usually a vocal participant, was unusually quiet, her stitches uneven as she worked on a patchwork quilt. When pressed for her opinion, she murmured something about the tragedy being a warning against greed and quickly changed the subject. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting abandoned as she turned the pieces over in her mind. Mrs. Clement's behavior was puzzling. Her piety seemed genuine, but there was a brittleness to it, a hint of something unspoken. And then there was Dr. Hartley, the young doctor who had been so attentive to Eleanor at the dinner party, yet so tense in Victor's presence. Miss Marple recalled his flushed face, the way his hand had gripped his glass when Victor made a pointed remark about secrets better left buried. Was it jealousy or something more? The village continued to whisper, and Miss Marple continued to listen, her quiet presence belying the sharpness of her mind. She knew that the truth, like a well-knit pattern, would emerge only with patience, each stitch revealing a little more of the design. Victor Langston's death was a knot in the thread, but Miss Marple was determined to unravel it, no matter how tangled it seemed. Over the next few days, the village's mood grew darker, the whispers turning into accusations. Eleanor remained in Willow Cottage, rarely venturing out, but her absence only fueled speculation. Some said she was grieving, others that she was plotting her escape. Miss Marple, however, suspected that Eleanor was simply afraid not of the police, but of the truth Victor had threatened to expose. She made a mental note to visit Willow Cottage soon, perhaps under the guise of offering condolences, to see what she could glean from Eleanor herself. In the meantime, she continued her quiet observations, noting the small details that others overlooked, the way Mrs. Price's voice faltered when she spoke of Victor's questions, the nervous glance Dr. Hartley cast toward Willow Cottage as he passed, the faint tremor in Mrs. Clement 9639's hand as she poured tea at the vicarage. Each was a clue, however small, and Miss Marple knew that in St. Mary Mead, the smallest clues often led to the harshest truths. As the week drew to a close, Miss Marple sat in her garden, the late summer roses blooming around her, and let her thoughts settle. The village was a web of secrets, and Victor Langston had tugged at its threads, threatening to unravel it all. Someone had silenced him, but who? Eleanor, to protect her past. Dr. Hartley, out of love or fear. Mrs. Clement, hiding a sin beneath her piety. Or someone else entirely, lurking in the shadows of St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes. Miss Marple didn't know yet, but she was certain of one thing. The truth was there. waiting to be found, and she would find it, one stitch at a time. Chapter 6. A clue. In the past, Miss Jane Marple sat in the cozy parlor of Sir Henry Clithering's country home, her knitting needles clicking softly in the late afternoon light filtering through the lace-curtained windows. Benham, a quaint market town some 20 miles from St. Mary Mead, had been pleasant enough, with the autumn leaves painting the countryside in shades of amber and crimson. A fondness for Miss Marple's unassuming brilliance had welcomed her warmly. He now sat across from her, his silver hair catching the glow of the fire as he poured tea from a fine porcelain pot. "You're looking remarkably well, Jane," Sir Henry said, his eyes twinkling with the familiarity of old friendship. "What's brewing in that quiet village of yours? Another mystery, I'll wager." Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes bright behind her spectacles. "You know me too well, Henry. St. Mary Mead is rarely as sleepy as it seems. I've come to ask about a man named Victor Langston. He appeared in our village recently, and now he's dead poisoned, I'm afraid, in rather dramatic circumstances." Sir Henry raised an eyebrow, setting his teacup down with a gentle clink. "Poisoned, you say? That's a nasty business. The name rings a faint bell, but I'll need more to go on. Tell me everything, Jane, and don't spare the details." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and began, her voice soft but precise. She recounted the arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the wealthy widow who had taken up residence in Willow Cottage, and the ripples her presence had caused in St. Mary Mead. She described the village tea party, where Eleanor's polished charm had both captivated and unsettled the locals, and the cryptic remarks about her late husband, Edward Grayson, that had caught Miss Marple's ear. Then came Victor Langston, the unexpected guest, claiming friendship with Edward, whose probing questions and unsettling demeanor had culminated in his death in Eleanor's garden. The village, she noted, was alight with gossip, with suspicion, falling heavily on Eleanor, though Miss Marple's instincts told her the truth was more complex. "I've seen this sort of thing before," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing briefly. "Years ago, in St. Mary Mead, there was a young woman, quite charming, who came to live at the old hall. Everyone thought her delightful until it came out that she'd been hiding a rather unsavory secret about her past. It's not always the obvious suspect, Henry. Victor Langston was no innocent visitor. I'm sure of it. What do you know of him?" Sir Henry leaned back in his armchair, his expression growing thoughtful. "Victor Langston," he mused, rubbing his chin. "Yes, I remember now. A slippery character, if ever there was one. He wasn't a criminal in the dock, mind you, but he had a reputation in certain circles. A con artist, Jane, and a clever one. He made a living preying on wealthy widows and spinsters, worming his way into their confidence with that smooth charm of his. Never enough evidence to pin him down properly. We had him in our sights a few times." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind already weaving connections. "Blackmail, you say? That fits rather neatly. He was asking Eleanor pointed questions about her finances, and I overheard a rather heated exchange between them at the village hall. She seemed frightened, Henry, though she hid it well behind that polished exterior of hers. Do you think he might have known something about her late husband's death?" Sir Henry nodded slowly. "It's possible. Langston had a knack for sniffing out secret scandals, hidden debts, indiscretions. He'd dig until he found something to hold over his mark. What do you know about her husband's death? Very little, I'm afraid, Miss Marple admitted, resuming her knitting. Edward Grayson died about 2 years ago, in London, I believe. Eleanor says it was a sudden illness, but she's vague on the details. The villagers, of course, are quick to speculate, especially now that Victor's dead. Some whisper she might have had a hand in it, though I think that's rather hasty. Still, there's something she's not telling, and I suspect Victor knew what it was. Sir Henry stood and crossed to a small writing desk in the corner of the parlor. He rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. Let me see if I can dig up anything specific on Langston, he said, flipping through the pages. I kept notes on some of the more elusive characters we never quite caught. Langston was one of them. Here we are: Victor Langston, alias Victor. Lyle, alias Vincent Langley. Charming, well-dressed, mid-40s, known to frequent spa towns and quiet villages where wealthy women retired. Suspected in 3 cases of extortion, 1 in Bath, another in Cheltenham, and a 3rd in Devon. But he always slipped away before we could build a case. Miss Marple listened intently, her fingers moving rhythmically. And his methods, she prompted. Always the same, Sir Henry replied, closing the notebook. They're trust, then start asking questions. Innocent at first, then more pointed. Once he had something incriminating, he'd apply pressure. Never violence. Mind you, he was too clever for that. He'd make his victims feel they had no choice but to pay up or face ruin, poison, that's new. He wasn't the sort to get himself killed, at least not in my experience. People change, Miss Marple said softly, or they meet someone more desperate than they expect. I've been thinking about a case in St. Mary Mead, 20 years ago now. A man, not unlike Victor, came to the village, charming everyone, especially a certain widow. It wasn't the widow who did it, though everyone thought so at first. It was her gardener, who fancied himself her protector. I wonder if something similar is at play here. Sir Henry chuckled. You and your village parallels, Jane, they're uncanny, but they're usually right. So, you think Langston was blackmailing Eleanor, and someone else stepped in? Or do you suspect her? I don't suspect anyone yet, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but firm. It's too early for that. But I do think Eleanor's hiding something, and Victor's death is tied to it. Past Henry. Is there any way you could look into Edward Grayson's death? Discreetly, of course. Discreetly is my middle name, Jane. I'll make some calls to my old contacts at the yard. Edward Grayson, you say? I'll see what I can find. Death records, coroner's reports, anything that might shed light. It'll take a day or 2. Mind you, the yard's not as quick as it used to be. You're a dear, Henry, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. I knew I could count on you. In the meantime, I'll keep my eyes open in St. Mary Mead. People talk, you know, especially when they think no one's listening. And there's a charity bazaar coming up. Eleanor's donated some books, and I'll be helping Mrs. Clement sort through them. You never know what might turn up. Sir Henry escorted her to the door, promising to send word as soon as he had news. As Miss Marple stepped into the crisp autumn air, her mind was already turning over the pieces of the puzzle. Victor Langston, a con artist with a history of blackmail. Eleanor Grayson, a widow with a secret. A poisoned guest in a quiet village garden. It was all too familiar, yet maddeningly incomplete. She thought of Mrs. Bantry's roses, how they looked so perfect from a distance. But up close, you could see the aphids lurking beneath the leaves, and church spires. By the time Miss Marple reached her neat little cottage, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village green. She settled into her armchair by the fire, her knitting in her lap, and let her thoughts drift. Victor Langston had come to St. Mary Mead for a reason, and it wasn't to reminisce about old friends. He'd been after something money, most likely, but perhaps something more. Eleanor's fear, that flicker of unease Miss Marple had seen, in her eyes, suggested a secret worth killing to protect. But whose secret? And who had the nerve or the desperation to poison a man in plain sight? The next morning, St. Mary Mead was bustling with preparations for the charity bazaar. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, made her way to the village hall, where Mrs. Clement was overseeing a small army of volunteers. The vicar's wife was a stout woman with a perpetually cheerful demeanor, but Miss Marple had always thought her smile a touch too bright, as if it were hiding something. Today, Mrs. Clement was in her element, directing the placement of tables laden with jam jars, knitted scarves, and second-hand books. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come!" Mrs. Clement exclaimed, her voice carrying across the hall. "We're in a bit of a muddle with the bookstall. Mrs. Grayson donated a whole crate from Willow Cottage, but they're in no sort of order. Would you mind helping sort them?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone as gentle as ever. "I do enjoy a good book, and you never know what treasures you might find." The crate from Willow Cottage was a jumble of novels, biographies, and old travel guides, their pages yellowed and spines creased. Miss Marple set to work, her small, capable hands moving with quiet efficiency. As she sorted, she kept an eye on Mrs. Clement, who was flitting between tables, issuing instructions with a nervous energy that seemed out of place. Miss Marple had always found the vicar's wife a curious, study, devout, yes, but with a certain sharpness that belied her pious exterior. It reminded her of Mrs. Elwood, a vicar's sister from years ago, who had been all smiles until her pilfering from the church funds came to light as she lifted a heavy volume of Dickens from the crate. Miss Marple's fingers brushed against something tucked inside the Pagissa folded letter, its edges worn but intact. She glanced around to ensure no one was watching, then slipped the letter into her sleeve. It was an old habit, born of years, observing human nature in St. Mary Mead, where secrets often hid in plain sight. She continued, sorting, chatting pleasantly with the other volunteers, but her mind was on the letter. When the morning's work was done, she excused herself and hurried home, her heart quickening with anticipation. In the privacy of her sitting room, Miss Marple unfolded the letter. It was written in a hurried, slanting hand, dated 2 years prior, and addressed to Eleanor Grayson. The signature was illegible, but the contents were illuminating. The writer alluded to a terrible mistake involving Edward Grayson's death, mentioning a missing inheritance and a need to make things right. There was no explicit accusation, but the tone suggested knowledge of something Eleanor would not want revealed. Miss Marple read it twice, her lips pursed in thought. It was not proof of anything, but it was a clue, a thread to tug. As she often put it, she tucked the letter into her desk drawer, resolving to keep it to herself for now. Accusations, she knew, were dangerous without context, and she had no wish to stir the village's gossip mill further. Instead, she turned her thoughts to Eleanor. The widow's charm, her carefully curated poise, was a shield, but against what? A scandal, perhaps, or something darker. Miss Marple recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once remarked that charm was often a mask for guilt. At the time, she'd thought it a bit cynical, but now she wondered. Eleanor's grief, if it was grief, had a guarded quality, as if she were protecting not just herself, but someone else. Over the next few days, all the while, she listened. The villagers were full of theories about Victor Langston's death, most of them centered on Eleanor. Some said she'd poisoned him to protect her fortune. Others whispered that Victor had been her lover, killed in a fit of jealousy. Miss Marple let the gossip wash over her, sifting through it for kernels of truth. The young village doctor seemed particularly withdrawn, avoiding talk of Eleanor altogether. Mrs. Clement, meanwhile, was louder than ever in her condemnation of that woman in Willow Cottage, which struck Miss Marple as oddly vehement. On the third day, a letter arrived from Sir Henry, written in his neat, precise hand. He had spoken to a former colleague at Scotland Yard, who had pulled the file on Edward Grayson's death. The official report listed the cause as heart failure, sudden but not entirely unexpected, given Edward's history of poor health. There had been no inquest, as the doctor who signed the certificate, Dr. Mortimer, now retired, had seen no cause for one, but Sir Henry had added a postscript. My contact mentioned a rumor, unverified, that Edward's estate was smaller than expected. Some talk of a missing will or trust, but nothing came of it. A missing inheritance, a hurried letter hidden in a book, a con artist dead in a garden. It was beginning to form a picture, though not a complete one. She thought of Eleanor's face at the dinner party, the way her smile had faltered when Victor mentioned her husband. Fear, yes, but also something else, resignation, perhaps, or defiance. Miss Marple had seen that look before on a young woman in St. Mary Mead who had poisoned her abusive husband and lived with the secret until a nosy neighbor forced her hand. The charity bazaar arrived, a bustling affair with stalls spilling onto the village green. Miss Marple, stationed at the book table, kept an eye on Eleanor, who had come to show her support, complimenting Mrs. Bantry's jam and admiring the vicar's watercolors. But Miss Marple noticed her glance frequently toward the crowd, as if expecting someone. Dr. Hartley was there, too, his face pale and his manner distracted. When Eleanor passed by his stall, he looked away, his hands fumbling with a stack of pamphlets. Mrs. Clement, meanwhile, was everywhere, her voice ringing out as she urged villagers to bid on a particularly ugly vase. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her eyes lingered on Eleanor, not with friendliness, but with something sharper, envy, perhaps, or fear. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned to trust small things. She thought of the letter again, its vague references to a mistake and an inheritance. Could Mrs. Clement know something about Eleanor's past? The vicar's wife had a son, Miss Marple recalled, a young man who had left St. Mary Mead under a cloud of debt. Money, as always, was a powerful motive. As the bazaar wound down, Miss Marple slipped away to the village hall, where a few unsold books remained. She sifted through them again, hoping for another clue, but found nothing. Still, the letter burned in her mind, its words a tantalizing glimpse into Eleanor's past. She resolved to speak to the housekeeper at Willow Cottage, a quiet woman named Mrs. Baxter, who had been with Eleanor since her London days. Servants, Miss Marple saw more than they let on, and Mrs. Baxter might hold the key to unlocking Eleanor's secret. The following morning, Miss Marple called at Willow Cottage under the pretense of returning a borrowed shawl. Mrs. Baxter, a thin woman with a nervous habit of twisting her apron, welcomed her inside. The house was elegant but cold, its rooms filled with expensive furniture that seemed untouched by warmth. Over tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward Eleanor's life in London, asking gentle, probing questions about Edward Grayson. He was a difficult man, Mrs. Baxter said at last, her voice low. Not cruel, not exactly, but hard. Mrs. Grayson was devoted to him, but I always thought she was relieved when he passed. There was talk, about money going missing. Mr. Grayson had promised her a grand inheritance, but when he died, there was hardly anything left. She never spoke of it, but I could tell it hurt her. Miss Marple nodded, her face sympathetic, but her mind sharp. And Mr. Langston, did he ever visit Mrs. Grayson in London? Mrs. Baxter hesitated, her fingers tightening on her apron. Once or twice, miss. He came after Mr. Grayson's death, said he was a friend. I didn't like him too smooth, if you know what I mean. Always asking about the will, about what Mr. Grayson left behind. Mrs. Grayson sent him away, but he kept writing. I saw her burn some of his letters, not long before we came here. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Baxter and left, her thoughts swirling. The burned letters, the missing inheritance. Victor's probing questions it all pointed to blackmail, just as Sir Henry had suggested. But who had killed Victor? Eleanor, to protect her secret? Or someone else? Someone who stood to lose if the truth came out? Miss Marple thought of Dr. Hartley's nervous demeanor, Mrs. Clement's forced piety, the letter's cryptic words. The puzzle was taking shape, but it was missing a crucial piece. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. She closed her eyes and let her mind wander, as she often did when a case grew tangled. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of its quiet streets and hidden secrets, of the way charm could conceal pain, greed, or guilt. Eleanor Grayson was no innocent, but neither was she a villain. Miss Marple opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the photograph of her nephew, Raymond, on the mantelpiece. She rose and penned a quick note to Sir Henry, asking him to look into Mrs. Clement's son and any debts he might have incurred. It was a long shot, but Miss Marple had learned to trust her hunches. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a quiet certainty that the truth was close, waiting to be unraveled like a knot in her knitting. The clue in the past, she knew, would lead her to the harsh truth of the present, and St. Mary Mead would be at peace once more. Chapter 7. The Hidden Letter. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the corner of the village hall, her knitting needles clicking softly in a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock. The hall was a hive of activity, with tables laden with donated goods for the upcoming charity bazaar. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, bustled about with an air of self-important efficiency, directing volunteers with a sharp nod or a clipped word. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the slight tremor in Mrs. Clement's hands as she adjusted a stack of linens, a detail that might have escaped a less discerning eye. The bazaar was a tradition in St. Mary Mead, a chance for the village to come together and raise funds for the church's upkeep, or, this year, a new roof for the orphanage in the neighboring town of Much Benham. Miss Marple had volunteered to help sort the books, a task she found particularly suited to her talents. Books, she often thought, held secrets as readily as people did, and she had a knack for uncovering both as she sifted through a pile of dusty tomes. Her fingers brushed against the cracked leather spine of an old novel, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, a favorite of hers. She smiled faintly, recalling the intricate web of deceit in that story, so like the tangles she often unraveled in real life. Beside it lay a stack of books donated by Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the newcomer whose polished charm had set tongues wagging in the village. The books were an eclectic mix: a volume of poetry by Tennyson, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, and a few modern novels with garish covers that suggested a taste for light romance. But it was a small, unassuming notebook tucked between two larger volumes that caught Miss Marple's attention. The notebook was plain, its cover a faded green, with no title or inscription to indicate its purpose. Miss Marple glanced around to ensure no one was watching. Mrs. Clement was preoccupied with scolding a young volunteer for mishandling a teapot and carefully opened the notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting, the kind that suggested a careful, deliberate hand. It was not a diary, as she had first supposed, but a collection of lists and notes, some mundane, others cryptic. There were grocery lists, reminders to order coal, and a note about a dressmaker in London. But on one page, near the middle, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a single line written in a hurried scrawl: "The money must stay hidden. H. Knew too much." Her heart gave a small, familiar leap, the kind that came when a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. H, she thought. Could it refer to Eleanor's late husband, Henry Grayson? And what money was to stay hidden? She turned the page, but the rest of the notebook was filled with more innocuous jottings: a sketch of a garden layout, a list of birthdays. Yet that single line burned in her mind like a candle in a dark room. Miss Marple slipped the notebook into her large handbag, a capacious affair that could hold everything from knitting to a thermos of tea. She did not consider it stealing. She would return it to the pile once she had examined it further. For now, it was a clue, and clues, she knew, were fragile things, easily lost or misinterpreted if not handled with care. The morning wore on, and the hall grew stuffier as more villagers arrived to drop off donations or lend a hand. Miss Marple continued sorting books, her movements slow and deliberate, but her mind racing. She thought of Victor Langston, the charming but shady stranger found dead in Eleanor's garden, poisoned by a substance the police had yet to identify. She thought of Eleanor herself, with her poised smiles and guarded eyes, a woman who seemed to carry a weight she could not share. And now this notebook, with its hint of a secret tied to money and a man who knew too much. Mrs. Clement approached, her face flushed from exertion or irritation. It was hard to tell which. "Miss Marple, you're doing splendidly with those books," she said, her tone carrying a hint of condescension. "But do be careful with the older ones. Some are quite valuable, you know." "Oh, I'm always careful, Mrs. Clement," Marple replied, her voice mild as milk. "Books are such treasures, aren't they? They hold so many stories, and sometimes more than one kind." Mrs. Clement gave a tight smile, clearly missing the subtext. "Indeed, now I must see to the china display. Mrs. Bantry is hopeless with fragile things." She bustled off, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The old lady's mind drifted to a memory from her youth, a time when she had helped organize a similar bazaar in St. Mary Mead. A local squire had donated a collection of rare books, among them a volume with a hidden compartment containing a letter that revealed an affair. The scandal had rocked the village for weeks, though Miss Marple, even then, had kept her own counsel, quietly ensuring the letter reached the right hands without fanfare. She wondered if this notebook held a similar secret, one that might explain Victor's death or Eleanor's guarded demeanor by noon. The hall was a chaos of chatter and clinking crockery as volunteers broke for tea. Miss Marple slipped away to a quiet corner near the window, where she could examine the notebook more closely. She opened it again, her eyes scanning the cryptic line. The money must stay hidden. H. Knew too much. Below it, in smaller script, was another note. Meet P at the usual place, 8 p.m. The initials intrigued her. P could be anyone, perhaps Mr. Petherick, the solicitor who had been at Eleanor's dinner party, or even Dr. Hartley, whose Christian name was Philip. Or it might be someone else entirely, someone not yet on her radar. She closed the notebook and tucked it back into her bag, her mind turning over possibilities like a gardener turning soil. Money, she knew, was often at the heart of dark deeds. Had Victor Langston been after this hidden money? Had he known something about Henry Grayson's death that made him dangerous? And what of Eleanor? Was she a victim, a perpetrator, or something in between? The afternoon passed in a blur of activity, with Miss Marple helping to price the books and arrange them on a table near the hall's entrance. She kept an eye on Mrs. Clement, whose nervous energy seemed to grow as the day wore on. At one point, Miss Marple caught her staring at the pile of books from Willow Cottage. Her lips pursed as if she suspected something amiss. Miss Marple made a mental note of this, filing it away with the other fragments of information she had gathered. As the volunteers began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered, offering to lock up the hall with Mrs. Bantry, who was only too happy to leave the task to someone else. Alone in the quiet space, Miss Marple took the notebook from her bag once more. She turned to the page with the cryptic note and studied it under the light of a nearby lamp. The handwriting, she now noticed, was slightly different from the rest of the notebook, less careful, as if written in haste or distress. She wondered if Eleanor had written it herself, or if someone else had used her notebook to jot down their thoughts. A sudden noise at the door made her start. It was only young Tommy, the vicar's son, come to fetch a forgotten umbrella. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, his cheeks red from the chilly air outside. "Mom said you might still be here." "Just finishing up, Tommy," she replied, slipping the notebook back into her bag. "Tell your mother the books are all sorted and priced. We should have a fine bazaar tomorrow." He nodded and scampered off, leaving Miss Marple alone again. She locked the hall and stepped into the cool evening, her mind still turning over the notebook's secrets. The village was quiet, the lights in the cottages glowing softly against the dusk. As she walked home, she passed Willow Cottage, where a single light burned in an upstairs window. She wondered what Eleanor was doing at that moment, perhaps burning more documents, as her housekeeper had hinted, or perhaps sitting alone with her thoughts, haunted by a past she could not escape. Back at her own cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled into her armchair with a cup of tea. She took out the notebook and placed it on the table beside her, but she did not open it immediately. Instead, she let her mind wander, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Victor Langston, a con artist, had come to St. Mary Mead to exploit Eleanor's wealth or her secrets. The notebook suggested a hidden fortune, possibly tied to Henry Grayson's death, and someone, perhaps Eleanor, perhaps another, had wanted that fortune to remain hidden. She thought of Mrs. Clement, whose piety seemed to mask a restless unease. She thought of Dr. Hartley, whose argument with Eleanor hinted at a deeper connection. And she thought of Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, who had been unusually quiet at Eleanor's dinner party, his eyes darting nervously whenever Victor spoke. Each of them, Miss Marple knew, could be a piece of the puzzle, but she was not yet ready to draw conclusions. Premature judgments, she often said, were like half-baked bread, and palatable, and likely to cause trouble. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept the notebook close, studying it in moments of quiet. She did not mention it to anyone, not even Sir Henry Clithering, whom she had visited only days before to inquire about Victor Langston. Sir Henry had confirmed her suspicions about Victor's unsavory past, but the notebook was a new piece of evidence, one she needed to understand fully before sharing it. She attended the bazaar, where the books sold briskly, and she watched Eleanor closely as she mingled with the villagers, her charm as bright and brittle as ever. One afternoon, while taking tea with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward Eleanor's past, oh so young it. Mrs. Bantry prattled on, unaware that Miss Marple was sifting through her words for nuggets of truth. By the time she left, Miss Marple had learned little new. To Victor's death. That evening, she sat by her fire again, the notebook open in her lap. She traced the words, "The money must stay hidden," with her finger, her mind racing. Mead had hidden a small fortune to escape a controlling husband. The parallels were striking, but Miss Marple knew better than to assume the stories were identical. Each puzzle, she reminded herself, was unique, its pieces shaped by the quirks and flaws of human nature. As the days turned into a week, Miss Marple continued her quiet inquiries, dropping gentle questions into conversations with villagers, listening to their gossip with a keen ear. She learned that Eleanor had been seen burning papers in her garden late at night, a detail confirmed by her housekeeper, Mrs. Higgs, who had mentioned it to the baker's wife. Cottage, ostensibly to check on Eleanor's health, but his visits seemed to linger longer than necessary, and she learned that Mrs. Clement had been unusually generous with her donations to the bazaar, offering a set of silver candlesticks that seemed far beyond her means. Each piece of information was like a thread in a tapestry, and Miss Marple was slowly weaving them together. The notebook remained her most tangible clue, but she knew it was only part of the story. She needed to understand Eleanor's relationship with Victor. His life. One morning, as she walked to the post office, Miss Marple passed the church, where Mrs. Clement was arranging flowers for the Sunday service. The vicar's wife looked up, her face pale and drawn. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained. "I trust you're well." "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, pausing to admire the roses. "You've done a lovely job with the flowers. They remind me of the ones in Willow Cottage's garden." Mrs. Clement's hands faltered, a petal falling to the floor. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes soft but searching. "A dreadful business. But I find that truth has a way of coming to light, like a flower breaking through the soil. Flowers, without another word. Miss Marple continued on her way, her mind buzzing. The notebook, the burned papers, the nervous glances. She was close to the truth, she could feel it. But she needed one more piece, one final clue to tie the threads together. That afternoon, she returned to the village hall, where the last of the bazaar's unsold items were being packed away. Depleted, and slipped the notebook back into its place. She had memorized its contents, and she did not want to risk anyone noticing its absence. She unfolded it carefully, her heart quickening as she read the words written in the same hurried scrawl as the notebook. Petherick knows. Be careful, Mr. Petherick, the solicitor. Had he been involved in Ellen's affairs, perhaps managing her husband's estate? Or was he, like Victor, privy to a secret that made him dangerous? She tucked the paper into her pocket, her resolve hardening. The puzzle was nearly complete, but she would need to tread carefully. The truth, she knew, was often a harsh light, illuminating things people would rather keep in shadow. As she left the hall, Miss Marple walked home, her steps slow but purposeful, her mind alive with possibilities. The notebook, the letter, the whispers of the village, they were all pieces of a larger picture. Keep her discoveries to herself, letting the threads of the mystery weave themselves into a pattern only she could discern. Chapter 8. A second tragedy. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her sitting room. She sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. On a pale blue shawl, the village of St. Mary Mead was still reeling from the shocking death of Victor Langston, found poisoned in the garden of Willow Cottage just days ago. The air was thick with suspicion, and Miss Marple's sharp mind was already piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that seemed to grow more intricate with each passing hour. The news of Victor's death had spread like wildfire, igniting whispers in every corner of the village. Eleanor Grayson, the wealthy widow at the center of the storm, had become the subject of intense scrutiny. Her polished charm, once admired, now seemed to many a veneer, hiding something darker. Yet Miss Marple, with her unassuming demeanor and keen observation, was not so quick to join the chorus of accusations. She had seen too many village scandals to believe gossip without evidence, and her instincts told her there was more to this tragedy than met the eye as she knitted. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the dinner party at Willow Cottage. The previous evening, Eleanor had hosted it with her usual grace, but there had been an undercurrent of tension that Miss Marple's sharp eyes had not missed. Victor Langston's manipulative charm had been on full display, his words dripping with insinuation as he spoke to Eleanor. And then there was Dr. Hartley, the young village doctor, whose furtive glances and clipped responses had caught Miss Marple's attention. Something was amiss, and now, with Victor's death, the stakes had risen. The village clock struck 10, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. She had promised to help Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, with preparations for the upcoming charity bazaar arrival, and Miss Marple wondered if there was more to her unease than simple dislike of a newcomer. Donning her coat and hat, she stepped out into the crisp morning air, her mind alert for any clue that might shed light on the mystery. Scene. Mary Mead was a picture of autumnal beauty, with golden leaves carpeting the lanes and the scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. As Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, she passed the village shop, where Mrs. Bantry was holding court with a small group of locals. Their voices hushed as Miss Marple approached, but she caught snippets of their conversation. Words like poison and Eleanor floated on the breeze. She smiled politely and continued on, her thoughts turning to the letter she had found among Eleanor's donated books the previous day. Its cryptic reference to a missing inheritance had set her mind racing. But she had kept it to herself, wary of jumping to conclusions. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement greeted her with a strained smile. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, ushering her inside. The parlor was cluttered with boxes of donated goods for the bizarre old clothes, books, and trinkets from villagers eager to contribute. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting the nervous energy in Mrs. Clement's movements as she sorted through the items. "I thought we might organize the books first," Miss Marple suggested, her tone gentle but purposeful. "There are some lovely additions here. Perhaps we'll find a treasure or two." Mrs. Clement nodded, though her attention seemed elsewhere. As they worked, Miss Marple kept the conversation light, asking about the vicar's recent sermon and the progress of the bazaar. But her eyes were sharp, watching for any sign of discomfort. When Mrs. Clement dropped a stack of books, her hands trembling, Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. There was something troubling the vicar's wife, something more than the usual. Pressures of village life. As they sorted through the donations, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Victor Langston. Sir Henry Clithering's revelation that Victor was a known con artist had been a significant piece of the puzzle. A man like that would have had enemies, and his presence in St. Mary Mead suggested he had come with a purpose. Blackmail, Miss Marple suspected, was at the heart of it. But who was his target, and what secret was worth killing for? The morning passed quietly, but the peace was shattered just after noon when a commotion erupted outside the vicarage. Miss Marple and Mrs. Clement hurried to the window, where a small crowd had gathered near the village green. "What's happened?" Mrs. Clement asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Miss Marple's keen eyes spotted Constable Reed, the local policeman, hurrying toward the crowd. "Something's amiss," she murmured, reaching for her coat. "Shall we see what's going on?" They joined the growing throng, where whispers were already circulating. "It's Dr. Hartley," someone said. "Found him collapsed in his surgery." Miss Marple's heart sank. Dr. Hartley, the young doctor who had seemed so uneasy at dinner, was at the center of another tragedy. She pushed her way gently through the crowd, her small frame belying the determination in her eyes. His surgery. A vial of pills was clutched in his hand, and a small crowd of villagers stood by, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. "Is he?" Mrs. Clement began, her voice faltering. "He's alive," Constable Reed said gruffly, "but barely. We've sent for the ambulance from Much Benham." Miss Marple's mind raced. An overdose, intentional or accidental, was a serious matter, and the timing so soon after Victor's death could not be coincidence. She noted the vial in Dr. Hartley's hand, its label partially obscured but unmistakably from his own surgery. Poison again. The pattern was troubling, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the argument she had witnessed between Dr. Hartley and Eleanor at the dinner party. There was a connection here, one she needed to unravel. As the ambulance arrived and Dr. Hartley was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, Miss Marple slipped away from the crowd, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She returned to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was visibly shaken. "Such a terrible thing," the vicar's wife murmured, wringing her hands. "First, Mr. Langston, Now, Dr. Hartley, what's happening to our village? Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile, though her thoughts were far from comforting. We must trust the authorities to do their work, she said, her tone calm but her eyes sharp. But it does make one wonder, doesn't it? Mrs. Clement nodded absently, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to steer the conversation back to the bazaar. As they resumed sorting, she kept a close eye on Mrs. Clement, noting the way her hands trembled when she handled a particular book, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that had been among Eleanor's donations. Miss Marple made a mental note to examine it later, suspecting it might hold another clue by late afternoon. Word reached the vicarage that Dr. Hartley had regained consciousness at the hospital in Much Benham. He was weak but stable, though he had refused to speak to the police about the circumstances of his overdose. The news only deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. Why would a young doctor, well liked and respected, attempt such a thing? Or had it been an attempt at all? The possibility of foul play loomed large, and Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Eleanor Grayson. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting forgotten as she turned the events over in her mind. Victor Langston's death by poison, Dr. Hartley's near-fatal overdose, and the letter hinting at a scandal in Eleanor's past, it all pointed to a web of secrets centered on Willow Cottage. She recalled the case from her youth, when a young man in St. Mary Mead had been poisoned after threatening to expose a family secret. The parallels were striking, and Miss Marple knew she needed to tread carefully. The next morning, she decided to pay a visit to Willow Cottage. Eleanor Grayson was, after all, at the heart of this mystery, and Miss Marple's gentle inquiries might yield answers where direct questions would fail. She dressed carefully, choosing a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan that gave her the appearance of harmlessness disguise she had perfected over the years. Eleanor welcomed her with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," she said, leading her into the drawing-room. The room was elegantly furnished, with soft pastel colors and delicate china displayed on a sideboard. Yet there was a tension in the air, as if the very walls were holding their breath. "I heard about poor Dr. Hartley," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "Such a shock for the village." Eleanor's expression tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, it's dreadful. I can't imagine what could have driven him to such a state." "Indeed," she said, softly, "it's curious, isn't it, to such incidents in so short a time." Eleanor's hands clenched briefly in her lap, but she recovered quickly. "I suppose it's just a terrible coincidence," she said, her voice steady but her eyes wary. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, her gaze gentle but unyielding. She had learned long ago that silence could be as effective as a question, and sure enough, Eleanor began to fidget. "I've been meaning to thank you for your help with the bazaar," Eleanor said, changing the subject. "Mrs. Clement mentioned you've been invaluable." "Oh, I do what I can," Miss Marple said modestly. "It's a good cause, and one meets such interesting people. Mrs. Clement, for instance, she's been quite preoccupied lately, hasn't she?" Eleanor's smile faltered. "I suppose so. The bazaar is a lot of work." Miss Marple nodded, her meek. Dr. Hartley's eyes flickered with unease. "Yes, Miss Marple, I don't know what came over me." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "Sometimes, you know, things aren't quite what they seem." For a moment she thought he might speak, but he shook his head. "There's nothing to tell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple did not press him. As she walked home that evening, the weight of the receipt in her pocket felt heavier than ever. And Mrs. Clemens's nerves, they were all connected, and Miss Marple was determined to find the thread that tied them together. The days that followed were filled with quiet observation. Miss Marple attended church, helped with the Women's Institute, and kept her ears open for any hint of the truth. She noted the way Eleanor avoided Dr. Hartley, the way Mrs. Clement's smiles grew more forced, and the way the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next tragedy. One evening, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple spread out her clouseau, letter, the receipt, and her own notes on the villagers' behavior. She thought of Eleanor's charm, so carefully cultivated, and Dr. Hartley's nervous demeanor. She thought of Victor Langston, a man who thrived on secrets, and Mrs. Clement, whose piety seemed increasingly like a mask, about a woman who had poisoned her husband to escape his cruelty, only to be blackmailed by a cunning neighbor. The parallels were uncanny, and Miss Marple began to suspect that Eleanor's late husband had not died a natural death. Victor Langston had known something, and his death had been meant to silence him, but Dr. Hartley's overdose suggested another player in the game, someone who wanted to protect Eleanor, perhaps to protect themselves. As she knitted, Miss Marple's thoughts crystallized. The receipt for the sleeping tablets was a vital clue, but it was not enough. She needed to know more about Dr. Hartley's relationship with Eleanor, and she needed to understand Mrs. Clement's role in the drama. The vicar's wife had been too quick to point fingers at Eleanor, too eager to deflect suspicion. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Mrs. Clement was hiding something, and she resolved to watch her closely. The bazaar had raised a tidy sum for the church, but the village was far from peaceful. Rumors swirled about Eleanor, about Dr. Hartley, and even about Miss Marple herself, who some whispered was too curious for her own good. But Miss Marple paid no mind to the gossip. She had a puzzle to solve, and she would not rest until the truth was revealed. The next morning she visited Dr. Hartley at his surgery, armed with a basket of scones as a pretext. He was pale but composed, and he welcomed her with a weary smile. "Miss Marple, you're too kind," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I'm afraid I'm not much company these days." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said brightly. "A cup of tea and a chat can work wonders. Tell me, how are you feeling?" Dr. Hartley hesitated, his fingers tightening around his teacup. "Better," he said at last. "It was a mistake. I wasn't myself." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "The mind can play tricks," she said softly, "especially when one is under strain. You've been worried about something, haven't you?" Dr. Hartley's gaze flickered, but he did not answer. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice gentle but insistent. "It's none of my business, of course, but I do worry." For a moment she thought he might shut her out, but then I cared for Eleanor more than I should have, and Victor, he was trouble. I knew he was up to something, but I didn't know what." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Trouble?" she prompted. Dr. Hartley ran a hand through his hair. He was asking questions, poking into her past. "I told her to be careful, but she wouldn't listen. And then he was dead." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And your overdose, Dr. Hartley, was that part of it?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what happened," he said at last. I took some tablets to sleep, and the next thing I knew, I was in the hospital. I swear I didn't mean to." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple knew she would get no more from him today. She thanked him for the tea and left, her mind racing. Dr. Hartley was hiding something, but whether it was guilt or fear, she could not yet tell. The receipt in her pocket seemed to burn, a reminder of the danger that still lurked in St. Mary Mead as she walked home. Miss Marple passed Willow Cottage, where Eleanor was tending to her roses. The widow looked up and waved, her smile as charming as ever. But Miss Marple saw the strain in her eyes, the weight of secrets she carried. The truth was close. Miss Marple could feel it, but it was not yet within her grasp. That night, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple turned the puzzle over in her mind, and Mrs. Clement, whose nervous hands and forced smiles betrayed a deeper involvement. The receipt, the letter, the whispers pointed to a truth that was both harsh and hidden. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a rhythm that matched the turning of her thoughts. She was close, so close, to unraveling the mystery. But she needed one final piece, one moment of clarity that would bring the puzzle into focus. And she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that it would come. The village of St. Mary. The second tragedy had deepened the mystery, but it had also brought her closer to the truth. She would watch, and she would listen, and she would wait. For in the end, the truth always revealed itself to those who knew how to look. Chapter 9. The harsh truth emerges. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window of her modest cottage in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a soft pink shawl. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the room. To an outsider, she appeared the picture of serene domesticity, gentle, elderly spinster, lost in her thoughts and her craft. But beneath that placid exterior, her mind was a whirlwind of observation, analysis, and intuition, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that was Eleanor Grayson's life and the death of Victor Langston. The village was still reeling from the shock of Victor's poisoning in Willow Cottage's garden and Dr. Hartley's near-fatal overdose. Gossip swirled like autumn leaves, with accusations flying toward Eleanor. She had seen too many village scandals in her long life to take rumors at face value. Instead, she relied on her keen understanding of human nature, honed over decades of observing the quiet dramas of St. Mary Mead as she knitted. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a conversation she'd had years ago with her nephew Raymond West, a writer fond of grand theories about human behavior. He'd once dismissed her observations as small-town gossip, but she'd countered with a simple truth: the patterns of greed, love, and betrayal were the same, whether in a bustling city or a sleepy village. Now, those patterns were emerging again, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel them. Her mind returned to Eleanor Grayson. The woman's polished demeanor, her soft voice, her graceful gestures had won over many in St. Mary Mead, was mentioned. The way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she poured tea at her lavish dinner party. There was something beneath that charm, something raw and painful. And Miss Marple was beginning to suspect it was tied to the death of Eleanor's late husband, Charles Grayson. Victor Langston's arrival in the village had been no coincidence. Miss Marple was certain. Sir Henry Clithering's revelation that Victor was a con artist with a history of extorting wealthy widows had only confirmed her suspicions. Victor had come to St. Mary Mead with a purpose to exploit Eleanor's secrets. But what were those secrets, and why had they led to his death? The letter Miss Marple had found among Eleanor's donated books hinted at a scandal involving Charles Grayson's missing inheritance. But it was maddeningly vague. She needed more. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook. Eleanor hiding something. About Charles's death. Dr. Hartley, why the overdose? She tapped her pencil against the page, her mind sifting through the possibilities. Dr. Hartley's involvement puzzled her. The young doctor had been visibly agitated around Eleanor, and his overdose suggested either guilt or fear. But of what? And then there was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose prim disapproval of Eleanor seemed to mask something deeper, perhaps envy, perhaps something more sinister. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 5, reminding Miss Marple of her appointment with Mrs. Bantry, her old friend and confidant. She tucked her notebook into her handbag, adjusted her hat, and set out for Gossington Hall, the Bantry estate just outside the village. The walk was pleasant, the late summer air warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming roses. As she passed Willow Cottage, Miss Marple noted the curtains were drawn, and the garden, where Victor's body had been found, was eerily quiet. She paused briefly, her sharp eyes scanning the scene, but saw nothing new. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry greeted her with characteristic warmth. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes. Come in, come in. I've got tea ready, and I'm dying to hear your thoughts on this dreadful business with Eleanor Grayson." To the drawing room, where a tray of tea and scones awaited. As they settled in, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Everyone's talking about Eleanor, you know. And now Dr. Hartley nearly dying. Well, it's all too much." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. "People do talk, Dolly, but talk is often more noise than substance. Eleanor Grayson is a woman with a past, that much is clear, but whether she's a murderer is another question entirely." Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows shot up. "You don't think she did it? But everyone says—" "Everyone," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "is not always right. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead years ago. Do you remember old Mrs. Trout? Everyone thought she'd poisoned her lodger because they'd quarreled over money. But it turned out to be the lodger's cousin, hoping to inherit. People jump to conclusions, Dolly, especially when a newcomer like Eleanor is involved." Mrs. Bantry nodded, though she looked unconvinced. "Well, what about Dr. Hartley? He was sweet on Eleanor, wasn't he? Maybe he tried to protect her and got in over his head." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "An interesting theory. Dr. Hartley is certainly involved, but I'm not sure it's as simple as that. There's something about Eleanor's past, something tied to her husband's death, that's at the heart of this. Victor Langston knew it, and I suspect someone else does too." Mrs. Bantry poured more tea, her curiosity unabated. "Being awfully mysterious, Jane. Have you found something? A clue?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, perhaps, turned to lighter topics. Village events, the upcoming charity, Bazarba. Miss Marple's mind remained on the case. As she walked home, she thought about the letter she'd found. It had been tucked inside a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, donated by Eleanor to the bazaar. It mentioned a sum of money and questions about Charles's will. The tone was affectionate, but tinged with urgency, as if the writer feared discovery. Miss Marple had slipped the letter into her handbag, intending to study it further back at her cottage. She retrieved the letter and read it again by the light of her reading lamp. The words were carefully chosen, but the implication was clear. Charles Grayson's death had left unresolved questions about his estate, and someone, perhaps the letter's author, had been involved. Was it Victor or someone else entirely? Miss Marple's instincts told her the letter was a key, but she needed more context. The next morning, no-nonsense woman who had worked for the Graysons during their time in London, Mrs. Dobbs, lived in a small cottage on the edge of the village, and Miss Marple found her tending to her herb garden. "Good morning, Mrs. Dobbs," Miss Marple called, her voice warm and unassuming. "I was passing by and thought I'd see how you're getting on." Mrs. Dobbs straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to stop by. I'm just trying to keep these herbs from running wild. Would you like a cuppa over tea in Mrs. Dobbs's cozy kitchen?" Miss Marple steered the conversation toward Eleanor. It must be difficult for Mrs. Grayson, all this talk about Mr. Langston's death. "You worked for her and her husband, didn't you, in London?" Mrs. Dobbs nodded, her expression guarded. I did, for nearly 10 years, Mrs. Grayson. Was always kind, but Mr. Grayson, well, he wasn't an easy man. I wasn't sorry when he passed, though I'd never say that to her face." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft with sympathy. "It sounds like a difficult household. I suppose there were financial troubles too. I heard something about a missing inheritance." Mrs. Dobbs hesitated, then sighed. "You've a way of getting to the heart of things, Miss Marple. There was talk, yes. Mr. Grayson had money, like what people expected. I always wondered if he'd hidden it somewhere." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her tone light. "Hidden it? That's curious. Did anyone ever come asking about it?" Mrs. Dobbs frowned. "Not that I recall. Not until that Langston fellow showed up here. He was nosing around, asking Mrs. Grayson odd questions about the past. I didn't like the look of him." And then she stopped, her face paling. "And then?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Dobbs leaned closer, lowering her voice. "The night before he died, I saw Mrs. Grayson burning papers in the fireplace at Willow Cottage. I didn't think much of it at the time," she said. "They were old letters, but now I wonder." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Burning papers suggested Eleanor was hiding something, perhaps evidence of her husband's death or the missing inheritance. But was she protecting herself or someone else? "Thank you, Mrs. Dobbs," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful." As she walked back to the village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife had been unusually vocal in her condemnation of Eleanor, her pious demeanor at odds with the venom in her words. Miss Marple recalled a similar case years ago, when a seemingly upright villager had been driven by greed to betray a friend. Was Mrs. Clement hiding something too? Her son, a wayward young man with gambling debts, had been mentioned in passing. Could there be a connection? Over the next few days, Miss Marple continued her quiet investigations, chatting with villagers, attending church services, and helping with the charity bazaar preparations. She observed Mrs. Clement closely, noting the woman's nervous glances whenever Eleanor's name came up. At the bazaar, Miss Marple volunteered to sort through donated items, hoping to find more clues. She found nothing as significant as the letter, but she did overhear Mrs. Clement whispering to Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, about keeping things quiet. It was vague, but it added to Miss Marple's growing suspicion. One evening, as she sat knitting by her fire, Miss Marple began to formulate a theory. Eleanor's charm, she realized, was not just a social grace, it was a shield, a way to deflect attention from her past. Charles Grayson's death had likely been no accident. Perhaps Eleanor had acted in self-defense, as Mrs. Dobbs's description of Charles's temper suggested abuse. Victor Langston had uncovered this secret and tried to blackmail her, but his death and Dr. Hartley's overdose pointed to a third party, someone who stood to gain by keeping Eleanor's secret buried. Miss Marple considered Dr. Hartley. His feelings for Eleanor were evident, but his overdose suggested he was either a victim or complicit in something larger. She recalled his nervous demeanor at Eleanor's dinner party, the way he'd avoided Victor's gaze. Had he known Victor was blackmailing Eleanor? Had he tried to intervene? Then there was Mrs. Clement. Her disapproval of Eleanor seemed personal, almost obsessive. Miss Marple remembered a story from her youth about a woman who hid her own sins behind a facade of virtue. Could Mrs. Clement be involved in Victor's schemes, perhaps as a partner who turned against him? Her son's debts provided a motive. Money was a powerful force, capable of twisting even the most pious soul. As the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple decided to test her theory. She would need to draw out the truth, and that meant setting a trap. Eleanor's next gathering, which Miss Marple had subtly encouraged, would be the perfect opportunity. She would plant a rumor, something about a hidden will or a new piece of evidence, and watch the reactions. Guilt, she knew, had a way of betraying itself. The following day, Miss Marple visited the vicarage under the pretense of discussing the bazaar. Mrs. Clement was polite but tense, her hands fidgeting with her embroidery. Miss Marple chatted idly about the village, then dropped her carefully crafted bait. "I heard the most curious thing," she said, her voice light. "Someone mentioned a will that might turn up soon, something about Mr. Grayson's estate. It could change everything for poor Mrs. Grayson." Mrs. Clement's needle paused mid-stitch, and her face paled. "A will?" she said, her voice tight. "I'm sure that's just gossip." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "But you know how these things have a way of coming to light?" As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Clement's reaction had been telling, and she was certain now that the vicar's wife was hiding something. The trap was set, and the truth, however harsh, was beginning to emerge. Over the next week, Miss Marple continued her subtle inquiries, piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. She spoke with Mr. Petherick, who seemed unusually evasive. When asked about Charles Grayson's estate, she visited Dr. Hartley, now recovering, and found him more forthcoming. He admitted to suspecting Victor of blackmail, but denied any involvement in the poisoning. "I cared for Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "I thought I could protect her." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind, but her mind sharp. "Sometimes, Dr. Hartley, protection can lead us to unexpected places." By the time of Eleanor's next gathering, Miss Marple was ready. She arrived at Willow Cottage with her knitting bag, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. The room was filled with familiar faces: Mrs. Bantry, Mr. Petherick, Dr. Hartley, and, of course, Mrs. Clement, whose forced smile did little to hide her unease. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple dropped her rumor about the will. Watching as it rippled through the room, Mrs. Clement's hands shook as she poured tea. and Mr. Petherick excused himself abruptly. The harsh truth, Miss Marple knew, was close to surfacing. It was a truth about greed, betrayal, and the lengths to which people would go to protect their secrets or their loved ones. As she knitted quietly in the corner, her eyes missed nothing, and her mind was already planning the final move to bring justice to St. Mary Mead.